Hello people, it's Chris again, and 23rd of October. We've just come out of lockdown in Melbourne, and very much feeling happier for that. The 15-kilometre travel limit imposed by the government as a result of the chance of COVID infection has now been lifted. It's only a matter of time before we can escape Melbourne and get into the bush again, and hopefully get overseas, which brings us to the reason for this particular episode that I'm putting together. Tonight, just one item, and that is a video of Mike VK7MJ and my coverage of the Trans-Alpine Railway from Christchurch to Greymouth in the South Island of New Zealand. A very dramatic train trip, one of the great train journeys of the world. Now, this series of transmissions on ham radio was started almost as a tradition by the late Tony Sanderson, VK3AML. Back about 1973, he would have crossband conversations each Saturday night. That was carried on for many years by Dave, VK3ASE. And in due course, Dave has moved on to other things, wants to have his Saturday nights back, so I seem to be filling the gap. Anyway, it's 9:29. As 9:30 ticks around, I'll switch that transmitter on, and I'll be on 147.475 narrowband FM on the ham bands. So we're streaming now in 1080p. I hope the stream's okay. I can't see any problems with it. I'll just check. Yep, all working well. So it being 9:30, I'll go on the air. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission. VK3AML. I've been carrying on this tradition that was previously organised by VK3ASE, and before him the original VK3AML, Tony Sanderson, back to his acquisition of a ham licence in 1966. So it's been going on a fair while. Fairly quiet week. Melbourne is finally out of lockdown, although we can't travel into the country outside of the Melbourne iron circle of suburbs and built-up areas. At least we can travel more than 15 kilometres now. And I hope everybody's enjoying the newfound freedom. And speaking of freedom, tonight, the video item that I'll be running in parallel with the audio transmission on 147.475 is one subject only. It's a subject that's been requested by my friend Peter, VK3ACZ, and it's the coverage that Mike Groth VK7MJ and I shot in 2019 of the Trans-Alpine Railway in the southern island of New Zealand. Runs between Christchurch on the east coast of the South Island and Greymouth on the west, goes through some of the most dramatic mountain scenery anywhere in the world, and at one point goes through a tunnel through the Alps, a tunnel 8.5 kilometres long. You'll see all of that tonight, along with some of the wildlife, human and otherwise. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. Now, this coverage never had narration, and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to ad-lib it through most of the next hour, so the pump is on me to get everything right in the narration. So without any further ado, it being 9:32 p.m, and this should take us up to 11 o'clock when we'll have a live discussion, hopefully, if anybody's about for a discussion, hasn't been bored to tears. So we'll go over to our clip. New Zealand's Trans-Alpine Railway, Christchurch to Greymouth and back, February 2019. And here we see a map of the South Island, Christchurch bottom right. The first section of the trip goes to Rolleston, watch the red line. Then to Darfield, a sort of a satellite town, railhead. Springfield, the last town in the Christchurch, the farmlands around Christchurch, then up through into Arthas Pass, which is there. The black line shows you the Otira Tunnel, which goes through the Alps, then up to the Taramacau River, then to Moana by Lake Brunner, the largest lake in the western area of the South Island, and then on to Greymouth, a city of about 14,000. We arrived fairly early in the morning at Christchurch railway station at Addington. You'll note that most of the passengers on the train were tourists, and many of them of Asian origin. It's very good that New Zealand has so much financial support by its tourist industry, and particularly by the Asian population. Coming into Christchurch Station, where we booked our tickets. Some of the old sign work from previous incarnations of the station. And here we are booking the ticket windows, moving out onto the platform of Christchurch Station. And there's the Trans-Alpine train waiting for our arrival. The train is very long, I think in the order of 500 metres, has a couple of diesel engines pulling. Of course, the first thing you have to do is to lodge all of your baggage in the baggage car towards the back, which we're doing here. If you want to watch this, please go to VK3AML 23 October 2021. That's on YouTube live stream. You can watch this on VK3AML 23 October 2021. Just turn down the background level a bit. Taking a walk along the train, that was the observation car just on our left. And the various passenger cars, very large windows in these, and of course they're needed for the very spectacular scenery through which you pass. There are the two engines up the front. I think there was one at the back as well. And at this stage we've moved into our seats in the main rail car. This is where we were seated for most of the time. We could go to the cafe car or to the observation car, which was open at the sides, not unlike an updated version of Puffing Billy. Off we go. And again, for those who are listening on radio, if you Google the phrase VK3AML 23 October 2021, you'll get the visuals that go with this test transmission. And this particular week will be very visually oriented, so although I'm transmitting the best narration I can knock up in ad-lib fashion, I really suggest that the visuals will give you the bulk of detail that I'm trying to convey. Moving through the rail yards at Christchurch, a great interchange centre for the Canterbury Plains farming area. New Zealand has a young geology, lots of volcanic uplift and geological activity which causes earthquakes, of course, as it did in 2011, but it also ensures that the farmlands are incredibly fertile with a constant renewing of trace elements. So consequently, the Canterbury Plains around Christchurch are very agriculturally rich. Many of them are hedged in the English fashion with long hedgerows, such as you see here. Windbreaks, very necessary when the cold winds come in winter. And there are miles of these windbreaks. In the background you can see some smoke. This was actually bushfire season in 2019, And that did eventually have implications for the return trip on this rail line. The bushfires licked at a bridge, so we were only able to take the train halfway back. The rest of the way back was done by buses the day after this. Moving now through Rolleston, which is a town somewhat outside Christchurch, not far out, about 20 k's. And this is the main road out to the west that we're following at the moment. Goes out through Darfield and then on to Springfield, where the scenery rapidly changes from this flat, fertile farmland to the Alps. And the New Zealand Alps divide the very, very wet west coast from the much drier rain shadow east side of the Southern Alps in New Zealand. The winds blow off the Tasman carrying a lot of moisture. They hit the Southern Alps, which are in the order of 10,000 feet, 3,000 metres tall, and that makes them dump all their rain on the west side. So the west coast is not unlike the west coast of Tasmania, upwards of 100 inches of rain per year in the old measure. On our way from Rolleston to Darfield. This initial section of the trip I just shot with the camera rolling out the window of the train with not much attempt at editing. But as time goes on, you'll see more and more of the reactions of people actually on board the train to what they're seeing, and the very dramatic sights, increasingly dramatic, that go on outside. We're passing a container terminal here, Lyttelton and Christchurch being an important port. Christchurch is the most populous town, the capital, if you will, of the South Island. And we're moving west. At this stage, the Southern Alps are a fair way off. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission. On this occasion, running a video of the rail trip from Christchurch to Greymouth in New Zealand, Greymouth on the west coast. It's the most populous town on the west coast, a population of 14,000, and it's on the Grey River, which provides something of a shipping port, or at least it used to in the days when Greymouth had a big mining operation in gold and in coal. It no longer has. It came to its peak during the First World War and has been sliding slowly from prominence ever since. So Greymouth has a lot of unoccupied buildings and mostly boasts of its former glory, although now its glory is in being the gateway to the west coast of New Zealand by rail and by road. Getting into the farming machinery part of the outliers of Christchurch at the moment. Rolleston Automotive you see there. You'll hear the occasional crying of children in the background from people that were on the train. I'm running a little bit of the background noise from the rail. This would be the equivalent of the Rust Belt in Melbourne, where the heavier industries, or at least this part of New Zealand, you don't get too many heavy industry. What you do is mostly in these towns. There are those long hedgerows in the English fashion. You don't see those very much here. And finally we get a view of the barrier of the Alps. For a very long time, Springfield was as far as you could go on the train. But then that they surveyed a pathway from Springfield to Arthas Pass through the extremely remote country between them, and that's considered to be a masterpiece of engineering, the section of the railway for which Trans-Alpine is most famed. This is all the rather calm, sweet but undramatic, flat and fertile farming country of the Canterbury Plains. I think we were just coming into Springfield at this point. And hello to Mike VK7MJ if you're watching down in Hobart. This will probably be the first time that Mike has seen these videos since we shot them about 2.5 years ago. The observation car, a bit windy. Everybody trying to find a spot from which they can film without obstruction, which wasn't easy at times, particularly as the scenery got more dramatic. There's Mike in front of me leaning out with his video camera. And a bit of an impression of what's around the backyards of some of these semi-rural properties near Springfield. Something that's different between farming people and city people in built-up areas is that farmers and their properties tend to have more area for storage, so that old stuff tends not to get chucked out quite so fast as it does in Australia. As a consequence of which, there's a lot of material suitable for museums lying around in people's personal collections. This is Springfield Station, the last station we go through on the Canterbury Plains before entering the Southern Alps of New Zealand. And for those who've tuned in on 147.475, you can watch the video part of this test transmission by dialing, or rather by Googling, VK3AML 23 October 2021. Sign next to people in the observation car, share your journey. Unfortunately, as they crowded into the vantage points, it was increasingly difficult for anybody to share anything, and it was a bit of a free-for-all. The outskirts of Springfield, just in the foothills of the Alps. A couple of phone towers up there. There's phone coverage for most of the Canterbury Plains, but once you get up into the mountains, it's very, very patchy. You really are stepping out into wild country, and part of the way that the railway goes is not followed by any road. No road for cars within miles of quite a bit of this. Over the first of the rivers. We followed the windings of the Waimakariri river for a lot of this trip, and you'll see that the rivers have broad, flat valleys full of grey gravel, I suppose you'd describe it. And what that is, it's the result of the melting of glaciers upstream, dropping their glacial till into the valleys. So you end up with these flat valleys of grey and white stones, with the rivers meandering through the fields of stone. It's an effect you don't get so much in Australia. Now we see the scenery becoming a little bit more impressive as we get up into the higher areas. Looking out from the observation car. The Waimakariri Valley. Somebody going wow in the background. That was in the observation car. I was leaning out the side to try and get away from people. As you'll see, a few arms and mobile phones strayed into the field of view, and hands. One wishes that Australia had similar scenery that was accessible by train. And thank goodness they kept this train line going as a passenger line. It's a real tourist asset for New Zealand. Getting up in the really high country now. At this stage, after Springfield, the train actually deviates away from any highway and goes into country that can only be described as outback. We're heading up directly north away from the main roads towards an isolated place called Avoca Homestead, which is not too far off this track. You can just see the rest of the train up ahead there. Oh, get your mobile phone out of the way, you idiot. Constant problem having to raise or lower my camera to get out of the way of other people rubbernecking. Now this is the first of many tunnels that we went through the hills. Of course, it being so mountainous, tunnels were unavoidable. There are 15 short tunnels on this Trans-Alpine railway, and 4 rather dramatic viaducts, including one 72 metres high called the Staircase Viaduct. And the problem with these tunnels was that in between plunging in and out of the tunnels you get very nice views, but you get the camera out, set it going, and as soon as you had it going a tunnel would come, so it made the whole thing pointless. But eventually I just had the camera going the whole time. I've edited this, of course, from the original, so that I could get tunnel and view, and then just extract the view in editing afterwards. There's Mike getting what he could of it with his camera, Mike VK7MJ. And I think we're about to head over the first of the really tall viaducts over the very deep, formerly glaciated river valleys. Here we go. Unfortunately, my frame rate was strobing with the fence that was alongside, but I think you get the idea of how tall this is. This is the Staircase Viaduct, 72 metres above the valley floor. Don't lean out too far. And we run along the cliffs at the side of that river for a while too. Going through the tunnels, people expectantly waiting to see what would greet the eye at the other end. And this gives you some idea of what the train was like as we moved through, I think, to the cafe car and then to the observation car. Very well designed in terms of viewing. And a remarkably modern train. This generates an awful lot of tourism for the west coast of New Zealand, so obviously they put a bit of money into the service, although I think they probably would be well served by having an observation car more along the American line with their Amtrak service, which is like a big glass bubble, because this is an awfully drafty place to be. Bad enough in summer when we took these videos, but in winter it would be absolutely insufferable at these altitudes. Below freezing, certainly, frequently. As I said, the rain shadow of the Southern Alps affects this part of the world, so that the rain in this part of the world is not very great. The clouds have dumped most of their moisture on the west coast rivers before they get this far inland. Not too much farming up here because it's a little bit too difficult of access. As with that, again, don't lean out too far. Looking down into the gorge of the Waimakariri. That runs out to the sea, to the Pacific Ocean on the east side of the South Island, a little bit north of Christchurch. And a lot of the water in it is glacial melt from up towards the top of the Alps. Looking back at one of the suspension bridges, or rather not suspension bridge, one of the viaducts. This is VK3AML testing and running a video of the Trans-Alpine Railway New Zealand, which you can see if you Google the phrase VK3AML 23 October 2021. That's Google VK3AML 23 October 2021. And for those who are actually watching the video and don't have to do it, my apologies for repeating it so often, but in the first half hour of running this on radio, it's best that the people listening in get with the program. Going through a tunnel, past the staircase viaduct, and getting up towards, let's see, it must be getting near Avoca Homestead or Haast Station, I'm not quite sure which. We're still over the Waimak Gorge. In winter those mountains will have a bit of snow in them, but at this time of the year, February, very, very dry. And as you can see, the very steep slopes of some of those mountains result in slopes that are subject to scree. There's a very remote homestead. I'm not sure whether that's actually occupied or not. Couldn't see any signs of life. This area actually reminds me of parts of Nevada, near perhaps Reno or Sparks. A little bit more mountainous though. Good sheep country up here, but who would want to live in this remote locale? I suppose some people get off on being in remote locales. There's some cattle. Up in the high country, they'd be breeds that were resistant to cold during winter. Those are the scree slopes I talked about, the falls of stones from the steep slopes. Very hard to climb without losing your grip. Beautiful grasslands. And here you can see that there is actually a power line running to some remote farm up here, but most of the telephone lines have been removed, and I can only assume that's because somebody has put in mobile phone towers in some spot that's suitable for the remote homesteads, or perhaps the remote homesteads are now using sat phones. You see what I mean by very dry, in the rain shadow of the Alps. More cattle. I think the rainfall in this part of the world is very much less than 10 inches per annum. It's oh, and there's one of us. I had to get a selfie in somewhere. And here we open out into the Craigieburn Strait. I think we're watching the edges of the Arthas Pass National Park here. Marvellous vistas. Something that there's nothing quite like this in Australia. You certainly know you're in a foreign country when you see this. This is VK3AML testing on 147.475. Somebody's got beehives out by the looks of it on the top bottom right there. Really getting up into the Alpine country now. But not a sign of a road anywhere there. We're really in a remote part of the South Island of New Zealand. One of the lakes up near Haast Station. I think it's, oh dear, which one would this be? Perhaps Lake Grasmere? I'm not quite sure. Beautiful the way the sun caught it. I think now we're following a tributary of the Waimakiriri called the Beely River. And this takes us up towards Arthas Pass. We've gained quite a bit of height here. I think the average height would be about 2,000 feet in the old measure, about 600 or 700 metres. By the time we get into Arthas Pass, we're up about 700 metres, I think. Arthas Pass is one of a very few spots in the South Island where you can get a road passage between the east coast and the west coast. Further north there's the Lewis Pass, further south there's the Haast Pass. This is the middle one, and probably the one that takes the most traffic. The only one which is accompanied by a rail track, incidentally. Somebody trying to get photographs done at my expense in front of me there. This is the final approach from memory into Arthas Pass, which is the only major town you go through in the high point near the top of the pass through the Alps. Quite a bit goes on there, as you will see. These are the rail yards for Arthas Pass. Gravel dumps, and we're starting to see houses now. And in the distance you might just get the West Coast Road. We're going over the Beely River at this point. At the bottom there's that glacial till characteristic of New Zealand rivers, particularly in this part of the South Island. We're about to go over that bridge there and get a good view downriver. Rivers in this part of the Alps run to the east, in Christchurch direction. It's only when you get to Otira on the other side of the range that the rivers run west. Beely River crossing. Lovely the way the sun catches that river. For those on 147.475, you can see the video section of this transmission by checking YouTube live stream, by googling the phrase VK3AML 23 October 2021, and currently we're streaming in 1080p. It seems to be going okay with no lost frames. A video that we shot originally in 4K on a trip by Mike Groth VK7MJ, who you just saw a moment ago, and myself from Christchurch to Greymouth by rail, the Trans-Alpine Railway of New Zealand. Looking back at the bridge we just came across. And beyond that you can see the road, the main road to the west coast, bitumenised road. You might see a few cars very distantly on it. There's one on the right, hugging the cliff on the opposite side of the river. One of the settlements along that road. Apart from a few isolated villages along that west coast road to Arthas Pass, there's not very much in the way of human habitation around this part of the world. Very occasionally there's a sheep station remotely. Oh, there's a bit of snow up on those peaks, even in midsummer. There's the West Coast Road over a dry riverbed. Back we go over the river. If people are watching on live stream, I might suggest, as this is in 1080p, if you could click on the 1080p tab and bring it up full screen, I think you'll get the full effect of this, and it does look to me on the monitor as if it's coming through rather well. And hello to the people on the text: Van Dan Escobar, Pirate, Dave Ranson, good. Terry Sims, nice to see you there. DJ Royser, who tells me that he's just got himself a unit end scanner UBCD 436PT, which I might look up a little bit later on. VK1DKO Canberra, hello. And Mike Groth is there. Good evening, Mike. And thanks for the compliments on the editing. Some of the video that we'll see, including some shot at Arthas Pass, is your work, Mike. And I hope you don't... Here we are. This is coming into Arthas Pass. That's the Arthas, one of the Arthas Pass storage buildings in their rail yard there. On the day that we went up there, absolutely perfect weather, as you see. When we came back the next day, it was teeming. So this is an area of the world very high up, hugely subject to changing weather conditions. Arthas Pass, 737 metres above sea level. And when we go through the Otira Tunnel, we'll be dropping for 8.3 kilometres at a 1 in 30 grade. Remarkable tunnel just beyond this point. But first let's visit Arthas Pass itself. Right in the middle of the South Island, about midway between Greymouth on the west coast and Christchurch in the east. That's the cafe car, closed while we were stopped at the station. And that's the dining car. Now a panning shot of the main street of Arthas Pass, only a quick hop, step and jump away. This is a bit shot by Mike actually. And at that cafe with the red cafe there, there's a resident Kia, a very large endemic parrot. And he sits on top of that spouting on the right there, patrolling back and forth and very obviously looking for stuff that people have left as they get up to leave. And the sign says, please protect your food and belongings from the Kia. It'll nick anything. There's the Kia, Mr. Kia, having a look at tables. Look at the way he's peering down. They're quite comical, these things, and highly intelligent. They can solve logical puzzles. They're recorded as being able to work together to achieve an objective. They've even been filmed preparing and using simple tools. And the collective noun for a Kia, a gathering of Kia, is called a circus of Kias, which says something about their behaviour. They're omnivores. They nest in burrows or among the roots of trees. They'll also pose for photographs, as you see. Proud little fella. They're quite large, actually. They're about 48-50 centimetres long. This is the Arthas Pass post office. It must have the record for being the smallest post office in New Zealand. One step up from a phone booth. But then there aren't that many permanent residents in this part of the world. And that bridge you can see in the distance there leads into that hill where the Otira Tunnel starts. The Otira Tunnel is 8.5 kilometres long. It took nearly 20 years to build it. It was first proposed about 1900, and the people in Greymouth built the railway up to Otira on the other side of the range very early. But it took from 1911 to 1923 to dig the angled descending tunnel, 8.5 kilometres long, up from Otira and down from here at Arthas Pass. And when they met up, They were just 10 inches off course. It was a remarkable engineering achievement. So that's the last look at the east side of the Alps as we are about to go into the tunnel. At this point they close off all the doors and windows because I believe the air in the tunnel is not breathable. In the old days they used to have an electric section of track that ran through the tunnel to avoid the pollution with a generating station at the Otira end. But I think that's now no longer current. They've proven that they can take trains through just on the air that's in the train. And you'll see we're about to hit the tunnel, the Otira Tunnel at the Arthas Pass end. There we go. Now it's darkness for about 15 minutes as we go through the 8.5 kilometre section. I won't keep the video camera running through that whole section. It's a very impressive thing to pass through, and that's a quick photo that was taken by somebody from the train. Rusticles coming from the top. That's the start of construction of the tunnel at Otira in 1911. And that's the breaking through where I told you they discovered they were only 10 inches out of alignment. Really remarkable achievement. And originally, as I said, an electric train ran on this section of line. I think it was the first electric train in New Zealand, but that's now been rescinded to diesel. And now here we are coming out at the Otira end. Totally different sort of undergrowth because the rainfall on this side of the range is enormous, somewhat like the west coast of Tasmania on steroids. There's water everywhere. We were very lucky to get it on a day when it actually wasn't pouring down. The township of Otira itself was mostly built to support the railway in the days when the coal and gold mining was booming back around the First World War. And now many of the houses are abandoned, only a few are occupied, and the design of each house is like every other one. They're poured out of jelly moulds. I suspect they're public works department jobs. Getting downhill a little bit from Otira now. Very lush, very green. Water supply is no problem here at all. In fact, keeping the water off is the most difficult thing. The West Coasters are a bit of a breed apart. We met a few of them. They're people that have a cohesive identity separate from the rest of New Zealand, I suppose. Until this train line was built, there weren't any roads originally over the top. So they developed their own cultural identity on the west coast. And there's a whole swag of towns, starting with Haast at the southern end, going through the Fox Glacier and the Franz Josef, up to Hokitika, Greymouth, of course, which with its population is the capital of the west coast, as it were, and then further north, Westport. There's a sizable waterfall. Now this was an interesting one. We were going through some chirping cicadas, and this little fellow hopped on board. Very different to the Australian cicadas, very colourful with very large bulbous eyes. And crossing a few of the rivers on the way to Moana. Many lakes. I must say Moana particularly impressed me with Lake Brunner on the right there. You can just see the edge of it. Lake Brunner is the largest lake in the west coast area. Freshwater, trout fishing all the year round. I say, looking up my notes. Largest lake on the west coast, kayaking, paddleboarding, jet boating, or simply swimming. And this is Moana Station. If you book a stop here, you can stop. I don't think it's permanently occupied. Moana is a very pretty little town, very isolated, relying completely on tourism. Only had time for a quick look around the town, but all these houses had a magnificent view across Lake Brunner to the distant Alps. Lots of tree ferns in the gardens there too. I'll make a few more comments about that later on. There's Mike, rear view, taking a shot of Lake Brunner. Of all the places on the west coast I saw that I wasn't able to spend time in, I must admit Moana and Lake Brunner is a place I wouldn't mind getting back to. Another selfie. Dear oh dear, vanity, vanity. And as you get closer to Greymouth, the built-up areas become closer and more populated. There's the town of Brunner on the other side there with the supply cables and water mains. This is the Grey River, where it comes out to its estuary. Again, lots of glacial till. And some very nice farmland too, I must say. Our train winding its way across various trestles. And that's the local television station up there. I'll say a bit more about that later on, but that services most of the central west coast area. Westport, Greymouth, Hokitika. The final approach to Greymouth. Population of 14,000, the largest west coast town on the South Island of New Zealand, in the Grey Valley. It was named after the 19th century governor of New Zealand, Sir George Grey, who also had a hand in exploring parts of Australia, as I understand it, as an explorer earlier on. The rise of the west coast started with gold discovery in the Taramaki Valley, 1864-65. But Greymouth, by the 1870s, was a centre for not only gold, but coal. There are significant coal reserves here and timber exports. Shipping coal to Christchurch was laborious and expensive, so there were plans to build a railway that unfortunately halted initially at Otira in 1900, and it took another 23 years to complete that tunnel we've come through to complete the rail connection across New Zealand. That signal box played a part in my ham radio receiving, which I'll tell you about later on, and this is the Greymouth station we're rolling into now. All of the buses that take you to different parts of the west coast, the Fox Glacier and so forth, were waiting for their passengers. This train is so long, perhaps about 500 metres, it carries an enormous number of people, and basically it's the commercial lifeline for the tourist industry. This is Greymouth on the Grey River, which you see provides a port, one of the few safe ports on the west coast of New Zealand, and that hotel, the railway hotel with the green veranda on the left, was the one that we were booked to stay in. Best described as rustic. There's the style. I'll take you for a trip into my room. The stairs were a little bit rickety and not all in parallel. We booked this sight unseen, incidentally, from Melbourne. Very basic, quite comfortable, but kind of rustic, and time had forgotten it. My room a little bit messy from unpacking my case, and I think this was after I'd had a kip. And to get to the window, you had to crawl over the bed. And the view from the window was not what one would call salubrious. It included that poster down the bottom there covering a hole in the wall adjacent, which was a poster for the New Year's Eve celebrations in 2013. If you turn your head on one side, you might be able to read that. The view from the back of the hotel, however, on the fire escape stairs was a little bit better, and that gives you some idea of the commercial hub of Greymouth. The West Coast Vape Cafe, of which I'll say more later. It's always amused me, wooden fire escape stairs, are they trying to get rid of people? The Vape Cafe, we tried to use the internet there and we couldn't. And we started wondering what was in the vape. That advertisement is for Shantytown, which is a West Coast equivalent of Sovereign Hill Historical Park, I suppose. We didn't have the time to get there, sadly. These are the main streets of Greymouth. It's quite a commercial centre, and although Greymouth itself only has 14,000 population, it services an enormous area of the west coast of New Zealand, the west coast of the South Island. You'll see lots of four-wheel drives and lots of high-ace trucks here. Quite a few cowcockies are around. We got into town just in time to see through the windows the latest edition of the Greymouth Star running off the presses. There's the paper that supplies the raw material for the newspaper. And I remember that I'd shot so many photographs and so much video, I actually had to go to a local internet shop and buy a terabyte drive to download several of the cards that I'd filled. They were 64 gigabyte cards, but I was shooting in 4K. This is a rather interesting jade fountain which you're invited to touch. It has a soapy feel about it that's quite indescribable. This is really an area known for greenstone. Revington's hotel is no longer there. These were some of the last videos apparently ever shot of it. It was a great hotel of the West Coast which had fallen on bad times. Originally had a veranda, which you'll see in this 1954 picture, the veranda on Revington's, and it had some very high-class clientele. In fact, this is where Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip stayed for the 1954 royal visit. Wouldn't believe it now, it was in its last legs. The Regent Theatre, the local cinema, a very large one too. It's a town that came to its peak in the First World War, and it's really never regained that level of commercial and population support. So consequently there are a lot of vacant buildings and a lot of hotels looking for usage. This is a mine pump, an industrial mine pump that's outside the local history museum. The museum unfortunately was closed on the day that we got there. That's Mike investigating the pump. So as close as we could get to the museum was peering through the front door at a few artefacts, fairly obviously related to mines and or navigation. The museum, like many buildings in New Zealand after the 2011 earthquakes, is being redesigned for being earthquake proof. Any building admitting the public has to be particularly carefully shepherded out of earthquake susceptibility. It was a gorgeous day when we arrived, as you see. One of the few really great weather days on the west coast. We're standing there on the levee next to the Grey River, and on the other side of the levee some surviving mine skips, although they obviously haven't been used for very long. That shows the rise and fall of the town. Rose in the 1870s and 80s with coal, huge amount of coal exported in the First World War, but now that's the way it used to be. Not a berth available, ships everywhere, 1911 that is, and the way it is now, dead. That's looking out towards the heads of the Grey River with unused cranes. Now somewhere out there is Sydney and Melbourne on the other side of the Tasman Sea. Couple of ore skips. This is VK3AML with a regular Saturday night test transmission. And if you'd like to look in on this video of Greymouth and the South Island of New Zealand, please look for or Google VK3AML 23 October 2021. That hotel on the right, the Union Hotel, Spates, is where we had a few very good lunches, a workers' pub. And that big building is the railway workshops. Much of it not used anymore for railway, but it indicates something of the scale of the amount of rail traffic they had here at one stage. I think there's a roundhouse there with a turntable somewhere in the grounds, but whether they use it or not now, I just don't know. There still is a rail yard, but not much of it's used. One of the Boss Cocky's homes, pretty obviously. There's some very high-class homes up on the hills just around Greymouth, up out of the sea fog. And this is the Newtown Square that they've got, opposite the railway station. Closer view of the Newtown Square. A rather nice coffee house on one side, Arthas, and on the other side a jade supplier. This is an area very well known for its supplies of greenstone, which are cut into these extraordinarily exquisite pieces of jewellery. This is the centre of the trade for New Zealand, this and Hokitika, and just as if to emphasise it, that outside one of the jeans shops is a boulder of jade, a boulder of greenstone. Kind of emphasises the richness of this area in a mining sort of a way. That's the back of our hotel, a slightly less lovely part of town, and that ominous vape cafe on the left. I'm still thinking about that. As you might gather, we did quite a wander around Greymouth. There's Mike distantly on the pavement way ahead of me there. I kept on the lookout for community radio stations here, and I think I spotted one too, which you'll see in a moment. That's the last of the Dick Smith signs I ever saw. Dick Smith had disappeared in Australia, and I think of the last of the Dick Smith outlets shortly afterwards disappeared in New Zealand. The broadcast antenna of Greymouth Radio in that rather quaint building, Greymouth 94.7, Westport 95.7. I think this was a Christian station, not sure. Local memorial hall and a general warehouse which supplies both food and hardware. Something I'd like you to look at with the forests around here. We have tree ferns in Australia, but generally they grow as understory. In New Zealand, the tree ferns frequently are the top story. And that cross, we never worked out what that cross was for, whether it was for commemorating a mine disaster or whatever, I don't know, but poignantly sitting in overlooking the town. This memorial on the levee bank next to the Grey River, rather cleverly designed, a perfect circle of granite rolling out of water with three miners depicted, three little short blokes. Short blokes were favoured for mining, but it's a monument in memory of those who were lost in coal mining incidents. And there were quite a few, as Mike will tell you.
No shortages of mine disasters, and they're basically in order from 1869, 1876, 1881, an awful lot in the 1896. There were several major disasters that year. I think a couple of gas explosions. gosh, an awful lot then, an awful lot in quite a few in the Edwardian era. (1911), 1912, 1920s, 1924, 25, 26, an awful lot of, several disasters in 27.
My God, look at
1932, including the last one with the gas explosion in 2010. A whole lot of when the I think the Pike mine blew up in 2010, and most of the bodies are still entombed. They couldn't get them out. Yes, there's certainly quite a toll from the coal which built the wealth of this place. Generally small men, I think, worked in the coal mines. You couldn't be too big to work there. Yeah, it was hard work, dirty work, and extremely dangerous. Now it's getting dark and the lights have come on, and this is Greymouth in the evening of a fine summer's evening. Some of the houses built up on the hill, I think they were probably the wealthy people, probably some of the mine owners. They could live among the smog. I believe Greymouth itself gets covered in fog, and an internet cafe in an old building. A lot of empty buildings. The coal mining has largely died out. The wealth of the place was started with gold, but it built on coal. I'm on a great levee, and this is the Grey River, and as you can probably imagine, the rivers on the west coast, where all the rain they get, when they decide to flood, they flood. This was only built in the 1980s. I can have memories of Greymouth flooding when I lived here in the 1970s. So that's the old coal port down there. They call it the Coal River. So Greymouth was, everything going in and out of the west coast had to come through to Greymouth until 1926, when eventually the railway tunnel got put through the mountains. And there was a land route to the rest of New Zealand. But until then, it was probably easier to get to Melbourne than it was to get to Christchurch, or possibly up to Auckland. And there's the bridge and the road going across the river and up to Westport, and then eventually, sort of, you go far enough, it'll end you up in Blenheim or Nelson.
That night, I commandeered this unoccupied, abandoned signal and shunting box. I was looking for a high spot that I could stick an HF receiver to see what I could hear of 80 metres at night. So I came in here, found to my surprise the door was unlocked. So I could squat down on the floor, run a wire out the door, horizontal wire, 50 or 60 feet long, and listen on HF. I wasn't game to touch any of those levers. I think I would never have heard the end of it. There's the old control panel, fairly obviously no longer used. But this little signal box was, I converted into a ham radio receiving station for one night. Very convenient spot to set up. And it was only just across the road from the railway hotel where we were staying. Bit of a view from out the front. There's Mike in the red high-vis jacket taking his own video. And there's the railway going across the road there, diagonally. This was the morning of our departure, so that there's the station. Going round to the right, our hotel was just down the road there. And the Grey River, of course. We took a bit of a wander down towards the mouth of the Grey River, and this lagoon is the site of where what appears to be a lot of fishing vessels tied up. Some of them were doing maintenance work. This guy was doing some angle grinding on some of the deck rail for some strange reason, which you can see there. And there was some bird life here. Cormorants, I think. There we are. This fella, looking out for his morning fish breakfast. And, oh, he had a poop. And off he goes. So that explains why all the rails are white. Looking across the other side there, you can't quite see the beach, but the West Coast beaches are like this. They're quite unlike Australian beaches because the winds here from the west are inshore, and the rivers, which run very fast, take with them lots of fallen timber from the trees. The winds then blow it back inshore, so the West Coast beaches are incredibly messy, covered in driftwood and all other flotsam and jetsam. Indescribable except to see it by videos that I'm showing you here. The sand is grey rather than yellow, the result of the fact that New Zealand is volcanic. Some of the beaches are brown, dark brown. One or two are black. The only golden beaches I've seen have been in the far south.
This is the Driftwood Festival on the beach at Hokitika. Obviously a lot of driftwood floats inshore. So the people here have set up kind of an art festival.
I must say the artistic standard doesn't particularly impress, but anyway, to each his own.
Incredible.
I don't know what the guy in the pit was doing. A model of a mine, perhaps. And all of this based on driftwood, a yearly festival in Hokitika. A model of a gold rush town made of driftwood.
Well, there's more than one way of using driftwood, isn't there? And Australia is somewhere out near the setting sun.
Interesting sand pebble sculpture there. Now that shows a little bit of creativity. A bunch of flies on sticks. But it's amazing what people can create out of driftwood. But these sort of beaches, you don't see this sort of driftwood litter on Australian beaches so much, mostly because they point in the opposite direction. I'll just stop the video on this, because this is particularly interesting. Mike and I were wandering around town and we came across a hardware store that seemed to have as much in the way of historical display equipment as it did of hardware. And this was a homemade motorbike of about 1906 or 7 vintage, with some very odd motors put into it, probably from some other purpose, repurposed for bicycle. Originally had been probably a standard safety bicycle, so-called, to which a motor had been added. When we went into this shop, unfortunately neither of us thought to take video of this. The shop was full of collections on display of old radio and telecommunications gear, including national HRO receivers and AR7 Kingsleys, transmitters of various types, receivers of various types, mostly valve. And we got talking to the chap, and he just believed that his hardware store would benefit by bringing in people who came for a look. So good on him. But it's a fascinating aspect of Greymouth. We didn't think to film it. And I'm kicking myself, so my apologies at this distance in time. I'm sure Mike will be laughing while he's hearing this too, because he didn't think to take the video either, you bastard. This is VK3AML, and if you want to see the video relating to the audio that we're transmitting at the moment, look for VK3AML 23 October 2021. Back to the video. What period? 1920s?
Oh, no. That would be Edwardian, that is.
Okay.
That would...
So anyway, we got back to the railway station and awaited the train for Christchurch on the return journey. And it was late, and the reason it was late was that some of the bridges had been licked by the flames of that bushfire we caught distant sight of the previous day. It was about an hour late from memory, and it was a fairly dark day, so as you see it had its headlights on. One interesting point was that it was hard to find anybody speaking English on the platform. I think Mike and I were the only two. In comes the train from Christchurch with the next cartload of tourists to head off in their various coaches up and down the west coast. The number of people that this train carries is unbelievable. As I say, probably a lot more of the tourist trade for the west coast of New Zealand comes through this train than comes via road or possibly even by bus. Kiwi Rail. I'm on the platform of Greymouth Station on the west coast of New Zealand. And that lady on the PA was speaking such fluent Kiwi that I had trouble translating. Mind you, the quality of the PA, which probably was built in the 1920s, didn't help either. People snapping photos everywhere, including me. This is the transshipment of all the people to the waiting tourist buses, taking them up the coast to Westport and down the coast to Hokitika and to Fox Glacier, Franz Joseph, and further down to Haast, perhaps eventually down towards Te Anau and Milford. Mike shooting the train, having shunted up the line a bit, is about to pull up and let the people on, and you'll get a quick look at what it was like to actually climb on. I think I left the camera running as I got on the train. Mike getting as far away from me as possible. Up we go. And we walk through one of the observation cars to get to our appointed seat. There are two observation cars on the train, one up the front, one up the back. I forget the reason why. I don't think we could go to the back one because it was first class, or I seem to remember that there was more than one class available for seating. Through the dining car. The cafe car. Note the Dick Smith sign out the right. That's the last time you'll see one of those. And finally, to our seat. I think Mike located it. You'll see him in his red jacket in a minute. Boy, some of those buildings are a bit the worse for wear. There's Mike. Now I follow VK7MJ until he finds the seat. And he's found it, and I get the window seat. And we leave Greymouth, going up the grey river, and look at the state of the weather up ahead. It is teeming. Of course, that's what will happen with the Southern Alps, the onshore winds bearing lots of moisture. People got into crossword puzzles and whatnot. This is coming into Moana on Lake Brunner again. The lake that was so blue the day before was very grey. Wouldn't mind staying at Lake Brunner. I just would be curious to meet some of the locals and to find out why they choose to live so remotely.
Well, greetings all. Here we are, sitting on the famed Trans-Alpine Express, and I'm afraid I think I've brought the bushfires with me. Last time I came and went to run on this, a landslip blocked the track at Arthas Pass, and now it looks like it might be a bushfire. Pouring with rain here, but it'll probably be fine on the other side. It's a pity it's not the other way round.
And look at it outside.
That's what it's like outside. Visibility down to about maybe 100 metres.
Boy, that was bad. Coming into Otira, we get a better look of it at this time. And this must be more like the average weather that they have at Otira, at the bottom end of the Otira Tunnel. And look at the way each of those houses is just like every other one. They're just poured out of jelly moulds, plop, plop, plop. Probably built in the 20s when they were first operating the railway. I saw this guy come out in the teeming rain. He's obviously very used to it, just takes it in his stride. This is on full zoom, so I could look at him better through the eyepiece than I could see him in direct. But he doesn't seem to be too phased about the weather at all. It happens every day. Shrug. Into his little van and off he goes. Probably working for the railway. I can't imagine why else you'd be up there. I don't think there are any shops. I might be wrong. This is a kilometre or so from where the Otira Tunnel starts. There's one of those typical houses. The same veranda on every one. All timber, all the same design. There's the veranda again, centrally placed. 1920s design, probably Public Works Department, New Zealand. Leaving Otira Station, preparing for the tunnel. From memory, we ran up a bit of a river valley here just before we got to the station. Height above sea level is 320 metres here. By the time we get to Arthas Pass, it'll be 720. So in the course of that 8.5 kilometre tunnel, it gains something like 400 metres. So it's not only a tunnel through a range, it's a tunnel through the Alps at an angle. Leaving Otira, heading for the tunnel. Not sure where that branch line goes to. I was intrigued to see that branch line there. Running up this little bit of river valley. As if the weather wasn't bad enough, we got a shock announcement as we were just about to come out of the tunnel, which you'll hear in a minute. Insofar as the interior was air-conditioned and very quiet, all things considered, it was very comfortable. Final approach to the tunnel. You can just, if you look very closely, see the old generating house that was next to the entrance to the tunnel where they used to generate the power for the electric trains going through the tunnel. I think you can just see it on the left of the window there, very obliquely. Greenish building, there. You just get a glimpse of it. There it goes. And now we enter the tunnel. And 8.5 kilometres of this. Something like 15 or 20 minutes to go through.
We'll be terminating
here at Haast Pass. I'll get that confirmation once we get some cell phone service. I heard this through the driver. When the coaches arrive, we'll transfer you straight from the from the train onto the coaches. We'll take your luggage from the luggage van onto the coaches as well. 3 coaches will be heading through to the railway station in Christchurch, Revington, where we'll offload you and your luggage. The 2 passengers for Rolleston, we're making you to collect your luggage so we know who you are and put you on the bus that will be going via Rolleston. So yeah, just be prepared for announcements. I'll let you know when I know what's happening. Please don't leave the station area.
All a bit sad. We weren't able to go back by train. We'd have to go by bus because the bridges further down had been touched by bushfire and they didn't want to risk them. I can understand that. And here's Arthas Pass again, but under very different circumstances from the previous day. Teeming rain. Not quite as bad as Otira, that's where it concentrates, but there's still quite a bit of rain here. The entrance to the tunnel at Arthas Pass is about 1 kilometre from the station, and we're just running up to the station now. This is the last that we would see of the train. Looking back to the tunnel entrance from the train pulled up at the station. Tunnel on the right. And when it rains there, all the hills gush with waterfalls. It's a bit like Milford Sound, not quite as much that way, but certainly you can see them there. Mike signalling his daughter about the change of plan. We had quite a bit of time to wait for the bus change over here, I think about an hour. So I climbed out and photographed a little bit at the station.
Quite a contrast to yesterday. Yet down on the Canterbury Plains ahead of us, one of the bridges is actually burned. So we're stuck here waiting for the coach.
And the roar of rain falling was such you can barely hear my voice. This young lady was put in charge of transshipping us to bus from the train. She had a very unenviable job because you can imagine the number of people disappointed in not being able to do the whole journey. But she did it with quite a nice manner and dealt with complaints as best she could. A view of grim Arthas Pass that day while we were waiting for the bus. And here are the buses to take us back to Christchurch. So we got 1.5 trips on the train. We should have had 2, one up, one back, but this is as far as the train could safely take the crowd, so at their own expense they provided a bus back. Mike in front of me there. In the floppy toweling hat. You notice people react to me sometimes when I'm shooting video. I tend to take the philosophy, seek forgiveness, not permission. If they want to stop me from filming and erase something, they're welcome to do it, but rather than run the risk of being told no, I just go ahead and shoot, working on the basis that if you're reasonably tactful and sensitive, you shouldn't run into troubles. And generally I haven't, only once or twice. I think that incident at the Cardboard Cathedral at Christchurch was the only one I had this whole trip. This is VK3AML testing on 147.475. We're currently running a video of a trip that Mike VK7MJ and I did between Greymouth and Christchurch, mostly by train, but on the last little bit back from Arthas Pass we had to transship to bus because the safety of the line was prejudiced by a bushfire. Night falling, we were running very late. I think we got into Christchurch about 10 p.m, as you see here. Back to where we came from. and then we had to go into a new motel hoping that it would be attended. So we were slightly panicking. This is taking our gear off the bus. And that's the end of the video coverage of the Trans-Alpine Railway, Christchurch to Greymouth. And on cue, my camera comes back on. Isn't OBS software wonderful? And I'll take that back. I'm not supposed to advertise anything on ham radio, am I? This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. In about 3 or 4 minutes, I'll open it up for discussions, should anybody still be about after all that video. A very long edit. I think that's the longest video I've yet shown on these Saturday night sessions, and I'll be interested to see who's about. But first I'll have a look at the text. L2 repeats. VK1DKO Dennis in Canberra says, I solved my inner city internet NBN issues by going straight to Starlink LEO satellite and get well over 100 megabytes per second. I wonder how you went on that, Dennis. Was it costing you more? I'd be very curious about that. And I see that we've had a constant 15 or so viewers on the internet stream, which is very gratifying. Thank you very much. So with that, I'll have to think, am I patched in? Just seeing if I've patched the radio in. I think this should work. So now calling over 147,475 for anybody who'd care to come in for a chat. This is VK3AML calling CQ and standing by for any calls.
VK3ACZ and VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
I'll just change my monitoring position. VK3ACZ. Peter, I hope you're happy with that coverage. I specifically, after your interest in the Trans-Alpine Railway last week, I decided to throw together what video I had that I and Mike had variously shot over there, and hope that comes up to standard. And VK3CG, Dave, nice to hear you there. So we'll take Peter first, VK3ACZ, VK3AML. Oh, sorry, that didn't come out. VK3ACZ, I forgot to hit the right switch, so I was saying that to the internet stream and not to you. And also acknowledging VK3CG. Peter, that video I threw together specifically in response to your request of last week, where you were talking about your interest in the Trans-Alpine Railway, one of the great railway journeys of New Zealand. So I hope that comes up to scratch. And Dave, lovely to hear you there. I'll take Peter first anyway. VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ. Good evening, Chris, and good evening, Dave. On the side there. Well, I'll start with a wow, a very big wow too. Thank you so much for that. Yes, I heard you mention me at the start of the broadcast, and I don't know where to start, but perhaps I'll start with I've done the trip twice, in 1996 and 2006 or 8 or something like that. I'm not quite sure the second time. And the first thing I noticed was the really dry scenery with no snow on the most of the peaks. I know both times when I hit Springfield, in fact, on the second trip I got up the front in the locomotive and did the rest of the trip in the loco there and back in the day. But yeah, there was snow everywhere. Now it would have been in early December. I guess the summer hasn't had the chance to melt everything. I've forgotten what time of year you said you went, but I gather it was more like March or something like that, if I recall. And yes, the new rolling stock really stood out. On both of my trips, it was the old pale blue scenery, nowhere near as flash looking as it was for your trip, of course. And why not? Obviously, it's a good tourist railway. The train was a lot bigger than I remember mine being as well. I'm so glad you showed so much scenery of Greymouth, because I both times we just did the trip there and back in the day, so I didn't really get to see anything except the subway store to grab a bite of lunch on one of the two occasions. You were right about that cross on the hill, the white cross on the hill in Greymouth. That was for a mining disaster. I remember being told by the conductor on the train about that while we were standing in Greymouth Station. If anybody didn't like that broadcast or couldn't stay tuned in for it, they're very, very hard to please, and I'm pretty sure you'll agree. And Dave, you must be pleasantly impressed with it all as well. I guess I feel a bit sad because it just makes me want to go back all the more. Still on Greymouth, the driftwood on the grey sand, some of the locals clearly have too much time to themselves, hi. And the return weather was exactly what like the entirety of my very first trip in 1996. It really begged us to have to do it again, to see it on a more pleasant day, and I can report that we did. The second trip was like yours, where there was brilliant sunshine all the way through to Greymouth. But anyway, that's enough waffle as a first over from me. Thanks again so much for showing it. Don't think you'll get any flack from anybody for what was a remarkable journey, very well filmed and very well narrated too. I quite enjoyed your narration through the whole thing. But back to you then, Chris, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, I just stood by for breakers in case any occurred or any came. Yeah, thanks for that. I was a little bit dicey about showing something that didn't relate directly to radio, which I normally do. But on this occasion, with your request and the discussion last week, I thought, well, this gives me an excuse to get all that material together. In actual fact, it wasn't something specifically that I wanted to do. Mike had been urging me to go on it, having heard the stories and having not done it himself, as far as I know. I think that was his first time doing it. And I think Mike's a bit of a gunzel. Every time he comes across here to Melbourne, or two of the times he's come, he's urged me to take him on the Puffing Billy Railway, and I believe he's sort of interested in railways in various ways. I've never been particularly into them, except that I've done when it was a possibility for me to travel that way, I did the San Francisco, East Bay, Emeryville to Salt Lake City run on the Transcontinental Railway, which is something I always wanted to do. But having had my arm twisted to do it by Mike, I'm very glad that he did. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dave, VK3CG in the group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group, VK3ECG. Yes, that was a lovely video. I really enjoyed that. And brought back memories of my trip, although I didn't get up that far. I was, in 2017, spent a couple of weeks touring around, sort of before and my trip to Dunedin and lecturing there, and it was very nice. My daughter and I travelled around, mostly a bit further south actually, and to the Fjord district and Milford and the glacier and stuff like that. So we were a little bit further down the west coast, where it was incredibly wet and rained the whole time. We seemed to spend our entire time in sort of waterproofs and things like that. But nonetheless, very enjoyable and very different from that very parched landscape, of course, that you showed, because of course the rain from the west just hits the west coast rather than the next plains. But yes, and that interesting sort of glacial till and really very interesting sort of soils and things around there, which were fascinating. Greymouth itself, I've never been to. I've never been to in terms of physical presence, although my voice has been heard there. I did a defence opinion on a case there some years ago now, which is my only real sort of fairly amusing story about Greymouth, and that is that you didn't actually show the courthouse, but I was giving evidence by teleconference at the Greymouth courthouse, and it was one of those cases where I prepared a particular question which I knew they were going to ask me with great care, and I had got a detailed note structuring exactly what I was going to say and how I was going to get this across, and I delivered this with absolute perfection when I was asked the question, and the courtroom seemed strangely silent after I'd finished, and I could hear sort of QRM, if you like, in the background, and I didn't quite know what was going on, and eventually the judge started yelling, saying, "Look, I'm terribly sorry, we couldn't hear a word you say. The courtroom's got a metal roof, and we've just had this tremendous hailstorm, and nobody can hear anything. Just hold on a minute, and we'll wait for it to settle, and then you can give your answer again." Of course, when you get told to give your entire answer again, when you've carefully prepared something, it never goes as well the second time as it did the first time. But there again, and all my New Zealand colleagues tell me the weirdest and most peculiar cases happen in Greymouth. But there we are. Back to you. VK3AML and group VK3ECG.
I can't say that I'm particularly surprised that odd things happen in Greymouth, because some of the things that Mike and I struck didn't quite make sense unless you looked for a subtext. And one thing was that vape internet cafe where the internet didn't work. I'm not going to say any more. But while we were trying to get the internet, the single internet terminal to work, and having a very nice cup of coffee though, people were coming and going to the counter, putting amounts of money over the counter and buying little brown paper covered boxes, presumably of vape, but what was in the vape was anybody's guess. And for young people, a place like that is so isolated from the rest of the world must have problems. But if you go to the next stage of remoteness, if you go right down the south of the west coast to a gloriously isolated place called Haast, which I was very impressed with, you can stand at the motel that we were and look south, and all you can see is one mountain after another plunging into the sea. No roads, no population. I think one person lives with his family in a bay about 4 bays down, and that's the last population on that coast, because it is so precipitous in the Milford Sound area, nobody can live there. Plus, the rainfall is something like 6 feet per annum. I mean, it just rains all the time, but just some days more so. But we went to the local pub at Haast, and it was a genuinely interesting crowd, although all of them were wearing woolies and gumboots, which said something, looking a bit like Fred Dagg, if you remember that character that John Clark did before he became Clark and Dorr, or whatever pair that was on ABC TV towards the end of John Clark's life. But yeah, interesting giving talk in Greymouth, and I can imagine it would have been a tin roof, and when you get heavy hail, which they do get on tin, it can be absolutely deafening. One of the great things about this little shack that I've got here is that there's a tiled roof, then there's an attic where I have a lot of stuff stored. Then there's a wooden floor in the attic which isolates me from noise above, and that's got pink bats in it underneath the floor above my ceiling here, which further isolates. So this is the perfect, because of the cupboards behind me, anechoic chamber and quiet spot. The one thing that really bugs me is that all of this digital gear, the computer there, power supply there, they all run these days with ventilation fans. And by the time you've got 10 of them running, you've got a considerable background noise level. I've never been able to achieve on my transmissions better than 45 dB sig to noise, Because the fans are going. I can turn down the mic and get the sig to noise up to about 60 dB, but as soon as I turn the mic up, if that's the worst thing I have to complain about in life, I don't have much to complain about, do I? VK3ACZ and group, with a pause for any breakers who might like to come in. VK3AML.
VK3 Bravo Lima X-ray.
Yeah, VK3BLX, would you like to take it for an over?
Oh, thanks, Chris. I'll have a quick over. VK3AML on the group, VK3BLX. Handle here is John. Not very active these days, but I've been doing a bit of listening around the last couple of weeks. I've caught part of your broadcast, both on YouTube and on VHF. And I've just come back from the lounge room, actually, where I've had the YouTube stream up on the 65-inch TV, just out of curiosity. It looks pretty damn good, even on the big screen. I wonder what resolution you're actually broadcasting or streaming at the moment. Interested in that. But, yeah, it looks good, even at that size. Interested in the New Zealand stuff tonight. Brought back some memories from a holiday that we had down in New Zealand a few years ago. And we had the same kind of weather you had around Greymouth. I think maybe that's pretty common for that part of the world, but it is beautiful. In fact, we went back, I think toward the end of our holiday, we looped back through there when the weather was good, and that was really fantastic. Anyway, pass it on. I'll pass it back to you, Chris, and yeah, very interesting and quite enjoyable to relive some of that stuff. VK3AML on the group, VK3BLX.
Yeah, the name is John there, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Chris. I think we have worked maybe a few years ago. I think we might have sat up here one night talking about light beam communication or something. Would that have been you?
Yeah, that would have been me. That would have been me. I'm sorry if I bored you with it too, but it's something that's been a sort of one of my strings of interest for many, many years. And it's got me to some interesting places too. Most recently, Deal Island in the middle of Bass Strait, where we set up a link with Chris VK3. He's from Moe South, and the other guy from Traralgon set up a station in the Strzelecki Ranges in Gippsland, and we managed to do a VK7 VK3 light beam contact. That was in January of this year, during one of those narrow periods where travel was open between states. It actually opened for about 2 months. Closed the day we left. Oh, what a year. What a time we're living through. I certainly had nothing like this before in my life. Nice to have you there on the communication, John. Briefly, the videos that you saw from New Zealand were shot in 4K resolution. I edit them down to 1080p, so that if you shoot in 1080p and edit in 1080p, invariably there's perceptible degradation. If you shoot in 4K, then edit down to 1080p, much less degradation. So I streamed a 1080p video stream through to the net, through what's called OBS software, which limits the maximum stream transfer rate to, I think, 5.5 megs a second. And so what you saw essentially was reasonable 1080p live stream. But when you say live stream, it does put about better part of a minute's worth of latency in there. I gather that they do that purposely to avoid the possibility of buffer underrun and the closure of the live stream. And at the moment, ever since I had NBN out here about 2 weeks ago to service our cable, which apparently had some corrosion points and poor terminations, and then Optus voluntarily changed the modem, our internet streaming has been incredibly problem-free. And if YouTube allowed 4K, I would try running 4K, but apparently at the moment they limit it to 1080p. So that's what we're running, and hopefully I've got something of a reasonable quality up on the stream. At the moment I'm just using a little webcam, which won't be all that crash hot, but it's just convenient for clamping to the rack that my audio mixer and peak limiter is in. to be able to talk to you. The only unfortunate thing about the webcam is that it does require a lot of light. There's a 15 watt LED light there, there's another 15 watt LED light there's a fluoro there, and there's another compact fluorescent on a stand there. And if you don't put all of those on, it drops the frame rate to about 12 from the usual 25, and you can see perceptible fluidity of motion issues arising. But on this, taking account of the limitations of this little camera, which is worth about 200, 180, something like that, the webcams these days, this one particularly, is pretty damn good. Can't do more than 1080, but then, you know, for that price, what do you expect? Anyway, round to Peter, VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ, just left a little break there. And welcome aboard, John. Good to hear from you. You're 40 over 9 to my QTH in Baronia, so nothing to quibble about with your signal there too. And you're right about the quality. It was just superb tonight, not one single little glitch. And we were putting up with a few for a while there, weren't we, through no fault of your own, of course, there, Chris. But yeah, it's magnificent now that it's up and running. And a couple more comments about the video. The vape cafe not having any internet, vape internet cafe not having any internet reminds me of when I was searching in New York City, in the supposed city that never sleeps, for an internet cafe at night time. I had a lot of trouble. Most things were closed. New York seems to sleep, all except for the light displays for advertising. But there you go. And hail on the tin roof. So loud. Who do they think they are? Coffs Harbour or Brisbane? Hi. I see they both got some, are supposed to have broken some records for hailstorms during the week. And you showing the footage of the Kia reminded me of Dr. Annie Jones on the ABC hosts a program on Friday afternoons. I can't think of the name of it, but it's something to do with weird and amazing wildlife. And there was a Kia on that yesterday, opening a bottle for a fella who just leaned out the window with his bottle of whatever it was, and the Kia decapped it for him, which I thought was quite amusing, but also not surprising, because one of the same tunnel where I was between Tianu and Milford Sound, we had a Kia land on the side mirror of the car, and clearly they have no fear of human beings whatsoever. Despite the fact that apparently there's only 3,000 of them left in the wild, according to what Dr. Annie Jones said. And yeah, he persuaded to take the key rubber off the door window and such like. But it was great seeing the Kia, and what an amazing bird they are. But you certainly captured one in all in his finest. Back to you, Chris, VK3AM. Oh, yeah, just I think John echoed what I said too about it being so enjoyable. We don't have to have broadcasts about radio, although addressing my comments to you, John, we are treated to some wonderful historical material of all different kinds, both audio and or visual at different times. It's good to hear somebody backing up my view that it certainly didn't have to be about radio or electronics tonight to be thoroughly fascinating and most enjoyable. Thank you again, Chris, VK3AML on the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and group VK3AML. Well, it's an interesting social experiment, pushing the bounds of amateur radio in terms of what it can do in association with internet, in association with live streaming. One of the things that disturbs me about present in amateur radio is that the art of the rag chew seems to be disappearing, and instead one of the aspects of digital comms, FT8, WSJT, it's great that people are experimenting, but they're not really communicating. It's nice to know where you can get out to, but hopefully communication involves a little bit more. So one of the reasons that I do this with the video each week is not an attempt to get the wrath of other amateurs or stimulate the department to take action against me because it might be entertainment or something. It's simply to get discussions going afterwards, and to keep the gentle art of amateur radio in its full communicative sense going. I think that was part of Dave's idea 2 years ago with the cross-banding, which I intend to revive when I get the facilities for it, which now will be much easier for me to organise HF transmitting facilities now that the shops are back accessible to me. They're about 15 k's from me, and previously I would have had to break the law to actually visit them. And when you're buying something of considerable value, you like to be able to get to the place to inspect the equipment and the condition in which it's arrived. Oh God. I'm taking notes with a biro, and the bloody thing, if people are on the stream can see, it's leaking all over the place, the bastard. That's the last time I buy a cheap biro from there. I won't say where I bought it from. Paper Mate. They're no mate of mine. But yeah, it's the idea is to explore. I think this is what's motivating me anyway. Is first of all to explore ways in which new media can be applied to amateur radio as a communications activity. It also gives me an excuse each week to edit some of the piles of home video that I've had on hand for years and never bothered to put together. Because when I am forced to narrate it as it runs, that gets recorded as a matter of course by YouTube Live and available in perpetuity, so that finally, instead of having to sit down for hours writing scripts and getting them to match, I can just do it off the top of my head under some pressure and get the bloody job done. So now there's another 90 minutes worth of home video that's got background noise and commentary with it, and is in some ways usable by other people. I just hope anybody from Greymouth who was watching didn't take my comments as being too critical. That's the Houma Tunnel you're talking about, I think, Peter, the one that runs from Tiana Downs to what's the name of the place? Milford Sound. Went through there myself, and unfortunately the whole of Milford Sound was thoroughly pea-soup fogged in the day we got there. We saw nothing. We got on the boat guy says, that's where you'd see Mitre Peak, and that over there should be hundreds of waterfalls, and all you see is white. I saw nothing the day we got to Milford Sound. I took a photograph, I think, at Tiana Downs as we were approaching it, and you could see this wall of white fog in front of us. Once we were into that, nothing. Just saw nothing. So one day I must go back to Milford on the off chance that I can actually see it. VK3CG and group, over to you, Dave. And interesting about you giving evidence in Greymouth. And I can imagine it being a bit like Queenstown in Western Tasmania, isolated, wet, takes a certain type of person to live there, and it's also a mining town, which says something. VK3CG and group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML on the group, VK3ECG, with a little pause, and good evening to you, John. Yes, I had a slightly better experience in Milford Sound, I have to say. It certainly was very, very wet, and when the rain became heavy, then things tended to disappear. But when the rain eased a bit, the sort of waterfalls coming down the sides of the sound and on the rock faces were just extraordinary. And everywhere you looked, a new one sort of sprung up as the rain kept going. It was an extraordinary place, but that tunnel I recall as well. It's not very far from the tunnel to the actual place where you pick up the boats and things like that. And in fact, although we'd had a car, where we were staying, I decided not to take the car myself through there, but my daughter and I took one of those sort of guided trips with a small minibus with about sort of 10 people in, and then we did the trip as part of that. It was just an easier way of doing it and far more relaxing, and we stopped off and saw some interesting things and did some sort of bushwalks on the way there as well, which were lovely to do. So that was, I think, quite a good way of doing it, actually. Yes, the Keas, I remember them. I mean, extraordinary birds, and just so tame. And of course, that's part of the problem. The reason I think their numbers are decreasing is that the young ones, particularly, don't really feed in the wild now. They have become totally reliant on the human population to provide them with scavenged food they can scavenge and so on, so that they're even more likely to go where people are. And they've sort of almost lost their sort of native feeding habits, and they're quite concerned about this. But I suspect there's going to be no shortage of tourists to keep them going for quite some time to come. But they are very, very amusing to watch. Their sort of boldness is really quite extraordinary. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the sort of rag-chew has disappeared. Not entirely. I mean, there's quite a lot still, of course, on 80 and a little bit on 40 and so on. But I think that's certainly true for the sort of VHF, and it's not quite the same. I'm trying to think. My first VHF radio I built was a series gate AM modulation from a little valve kit in the UK. And that worked very well for the smaller rag chews. And of course, I just had a sort of a low crystal, a high crystal, and a medium crystal, with no VFO, and so you just tune the band from high to low, hoping to catch someone who was, putting out your call sign. So these are the days before everyone had sort of VFOs on 2 meters. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it nowadays. But that's what it was like. And I had an old Lafayette, I think. Shortwave receiver, nothing very exciting. One of those sort of, I think it was an 8030 or something like that. And I had a little 2-meter converter, so that because the UK was 144 to 146, and we had it just converted from essentially 28 to 30 to the UK 2-meter band, and that sort of worked reasonably well, although effectively you still had to switch over antennas from transmit and receive, because this is all put together from bits and pieces, and rather than an integrated transceiver, which I certainly didn't have for many years after that. Then I got hold of an old Pi Ranger, I think, was an old AM taxi. Someone was selling a whole lot of these old taxi transceivers, and then at least I could transmit and receive on the same frequency. And a group of about 3 or 4 of us, sort of school friends and a couple of others, and all got crystals for this thing, and we used to use that. That was quite fun. Just had an old car battery powering that up, and I'd put the car battery on trickle charge the rest of the time. So early days of AM VHF, and this would have been in the sort of, it would have been in the early 70s actually. So a different sort of experience today. But again, rag chewing and so on was really quite was the way to go, really. It wasn't until a little bit later that I started having fun trying to get longer distance things on 2 meters sideband in the fog and so on, where things would suddenly open up and you'd hear, right into Germany from the middle of England, just on these weird tropospheric ducting and things like that, which were rather fun. Very different from FT8 and things like that today. But no, it's a very different game. Anyway, Chris, back to you. VK3AML in the group, VK3ECG.
Yeah, I'll bring John in a minute 3BLX. Series Gate AM mod. There was circuit that the late Dan Van Alken 3UI used to use on 160 metres called a clamp tube modulation. It was some form of screen grid modulation from memory, not terribly linear, so the quality wasn't huge, wasn't very great, but with that you could transmit good AM, relatively good AM, without a modulation transformer, and in the 60s particularly, good modulation transformers were incredibly expensive. Like you're talking close to a week's salary. They were big too. I have a couple of them here. These days you can pick them up for a song because nobody wants them. Nobody wants to run AM. If you can find them, they are still few and far between. But I can remember, I certainly didn't have a license then, but I sat in on the shack of VK3ZEP, who's now in his early 70s. He was then 18, 19 at RMIT doing a electrical engineering course. Later worked for Plessy. And I used to sit in his shack. He had a Kingsley AR7X World War II as his main receiver. That was working with a front-end converter. I don't remember the valve in the front end, except I remember he said it was a lot more sensitive when he changed the front end valve from, I think, a pentode to a frame grid tube or something. Just hang on a sec, I'm hearing clicks. I'm hearing funny noises here, hang on. No, seems to have stopped. I thought it might be arcing for a minute. That was very strange. Nothing getting too hot, I'll just check the power supply. No, power supply is as cool as a cucumber. No, all fixed. Sorry about that. But yeah, the same arrangement in Melbourne in the mid-60s. I remember this guy calling CQ using something like the 10th harmonic of some HF crystal that he had to get him out on 2 metres AM, and then saying, tuning the band high to low, and he had a dial that was actually marked with Technicolor of the frequencies of different other amateurs he'd spoken to. You could actually, if you knew you were going to talk to one particular guy, you could actually tune to their frequency. Individualistic. It only works if there are a very small number of stations on the band. Round to VK3BLX, if you're still there, John. I hope I'm not hogging it too much. VK3AML.
VK3AML on the group, VK3BLX? Oh, not at all, not at all. Hey, this is your night. A couple of comments on some of the things I've been talking about. Rag chews, yes, always love the rag chew. David, you brought back some memories talking about AM on 2 metres. That's where I got my start when I first got my licence, which I think was, I'm going to show my age now, I think it was back 1966 or thereabouts when I was still at school. I got my ham ticket. Limited call in those days. I was VK3ZTO, and 2 metres AM was where I started. Did a bit of 6 metres as well. The modulator, and I think it might even be buried out in the garage somewhere still. I think it was a pair of 807s, and somehow or other I laid my hands on a pretty good modulation transformer. Chris, I'm not quite sure how I came by it. Was it Waltham Trading Co? Probably not, but one of those sorts of sources. So they were great times, no doubt about it. In the 1980s, I got into a bit of amateur TV, and that's sort of been a bit of an interest just lately. I started watching and looking at what's going on the digital repeater, 3R TV, and chatting to a couple of the guys there, sort of contemplating maybe dipping a toe back in the ATV waters one of these days. It's a little bit more difficult to get on the air these days than it was then, though. I mean, everything I had for the amateur TV back in the 80s was totally homemade from, components up. Some of it sort of designed myself. It was pretty straightforward by comparison to now, with the requirements for all the digital encoding and Raspberry Pis and software to find radios and all the rest to make anything that can get a signal to air. But it's tempting to maybe move in that direction. Actually, after one of the amateur Astronomical Society Victoria broadcast that Clint puts on, Clint 3 CSJ, after he finished that, he decided to run a bit of YouTube stuff that he had, and I think it was a lecture by Lawrence Bragg late in his career. He's giving a public lecture, which I think was not an uncommon thing in Britain. So we looked at that, we were chatting about some of that stuff. So those are really good topics to get into rag chews about. And certainly tour through New Zealand is definitely not out of the realms of what we ought to be looking at and talking about. Sure, radio's fine, but you know, it's not everything, is it? Now, I jotted down something else here. I was thinking, I thought you might have been using a fountain pen when I was looking at your page there, Chris, but it's just a biro. Oh well. David's presentation in New Zealand. Look, David, given that your first presentation was drowned out by the hail, I'm sure everybody thought the one they actually heard was perfect, so I wouldn't have worried about it. All right, that's enough for me for the moment. Put it back to you, Chris, and you can pass it around. VK3AML and the group VK3BLX.
Before you move on, John, does the address 9 Dominic Street, East Camberwell mean anything to you?
It's practically tattooed on my back.
Yeah, I just looked up, I don't know whether you're looking on the live stream, the first call book I ever bought, 1966. You're in it.
Yeah, that was me. What were you around shortly thereafter?
I was around before that. My background, my background in ham radio, I was babysat at the age of 4, when talking 56 Melbourne Olympics, by a pair of radio hams who lived directly opposite where we were, in their radio shack. When thinking back, with all of the exposed 1 kV cables in that shack, they would have gone to jail for endangering a child these days, but they encouraged me to do things like fiddle the knobs until I got a perfect triangle in the modulation pattern on the crow they had. I became the sort of the party piece, you know, bring that kid in from over the road. We'll get them to show how he can produce a perfect trapezoid. And there you are, a 4-year-old kid can do it. So I didn't know what I was doing. I was just sort of turning knobs until I saw the pretty triangle. But I was introduced to ham radio at a very early age, and I think it stuck for that reason. Associated a lot with ham radio. I didn't get the license, though, for about 40 years, because I was associated with VK3UI back about 1972 in a project to try and get moving picture slow scan with sufficient number of pictures per second to produce a reasonable illusion of movement, which we did get, and then approached the WIA for help, and the WIA stomped it. They considered that we were cheeky young upstarts and, you know, considered that we were lying about what we'd achieved when we actually were able to achieve it. So that put me off getting a licence for 36 years until 2006. But I've been interested all along. Back to you, John, for a quick comment before we move on.
Oh, that's fascinating. When we've got a bit more time, I'd like to hear a little bit about what the mechanism you were using to get the higher frame rates in slow scan would have been. I played around with slow scan TV in those days as well. I was fortunate enough to get a job with, well, it was the PMG when I started, Telstra later on, of course, and I learned a great deal about digital logic and stuff in the job that I got into. And next thing you know, of course, I was designing myself fast scan to slow scan converter and that sort of stuff, and I had a black and white slow scan, standard, you know, PAL camera, feeding into this analog A to D and a whole lot of TTL logic and, you know, lots of counters and monos and God knows what, and slow scan coming out the other end. And I had a lot of fun with that. So, yeah, must talk to you about what you were doing to get that higher frame rate. Oh, yes, there's all sorts of reminiscing we could do. God, the rest of the people on the channel here would be all going off to bed if we're not careful, Chris. VK3AML, VK3BLX.
Yeah, no worries, John. It was actually a mechanical scanner at the camera end and a crow tube suitably deflected in sync at the receiving end. using medium persistence phosphor P2, not P7. P7 was the blue flash and the yellow-green afterglow. P2 was a slightly faster persistence, but it still produced a reasonable grayscale. Get back on track. The Kia, Peter, the Kia, an incredibly intelligent creature. I made one thing I saw while I was in Arthas Pass, which I didn't have the camera going fast enough to catch it, but this Kia flew down to a wheelie bin, and there was a complicated catch on the wheelie bin designed to foil the Kia, but the Kia had learned to undo the catch, then toss the wheelie bin lid up until it was resting on his head when he was perched on the edge, and he could peer around inside, and he picked up one or two little things, munch, 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 then he threw his head back a little bit, wheelie bin pops up, and he flew off. So he knew how to foil an anti-Kia catch on a wheelie bin, which really... I took some notes before we started on them, and it said it's believed to be the world's only Alpine Parrot. It's one of 10 endemic parrot species in New Zealand, which includes the rarest one of the lot, which is the kakapo, of which there are only about 10 pairs now on an island off the south coast of New Zealand. The Kia is omnivorous. It nests in burrows or among the roots of trees. Known for its intelligence and curiosity, both vital to their survival in a harsh mountain environment. They can solve logical puzzles. It's been proven that they'll work together to achieve a common objective. They have been filmed preparing and using tools. And I think I mentioned on the track, a gathering, the collective noun for a group of Kias is a circus of Kias, and there's a good reason for that. VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ, and unfortunately I'll have to dumb down the conversation from what it's been the last couple of overs, but that was still very interesting to listen to, your reminiscences and your slow scan and ATV and the rest of it, really good stuff. Yeah, that's super impressive, the Kia, and I love that little bit of film footage of the Kia knocking the top off the beer bottle or whatever it was for the fellow who just lent his bottle out the window of the car, and the Kia obliged as if on cue. Yeah, probably done it before. From everything you're saying there. Pretty good, yeah. Shades of animal intelligence, similar to what a dear fellow once told me about his youth on a farm where they had foxes getting into the chickens, so they devised a hatch where you pulled on a rope, on a pulley, and it lifted the hatch so that you could remove the eggs and put food in for the chooks and all that, and it took the fox only one night to figure out that if you pulled on the rope, the hatch lifted, and because there was a big commotion, and he went running out there with the torch with all the chickens going berserk, and there was Mickey Mox there in the middle of them with a cheeky grin on his face. So, yeah, animal intelligence, you've got to love them. And you're talking about rag chews before. I've got two firmly in my memory from HF, where it's not all that common. Yes, probably on 80, and I've heard it said often that 40's a rag chew band. Not in my experience, but I did one afternoon on the long path, spoke for about an hour with a station in Switzerland, and we both commented on the time that how rare it is and how wonderful it is to have a good solid conversation and not just the signal report and hit and run. And I know many's a time I try to engage people further than just 5973 get lost, QRZ. And I've often thought, well, perhaps it's the language barrier that prevents them, and that would be genuine, I'm sure. But other times it's just, no, some people do really just want the maximum number in their logbook. More's a pity. Another very pleasant rag chew I had for an hour was with a fellow in Edmonton, Canada. And when I looked up his QRZ page, I was insanely jealous because he had a huge aerial farm, which even included a rotatable 2-element Yagi on 80 metres. Oh boy, yeah, and not a trapped one. But yeah, so that's the rag tube. You also mentioned Queenstown in Tasmania before. I will never forget my initial impressions of Queenstown because I'm coming up from Hobart, and as you know, some of the button grass plains in that region have to be seen to be believed. It's just beautiful. You know, you've got the impressive look of Frenchman's Cap and some other jagged rocky peaks there as you're going along, and I looked on the map and the next place is Queenstown. Well, if Queenstown has the sort of scenery that you've only got to look out your kitchen window to see, this is where I want to settle. I'm going to live in Queenstown. And of course, coming up when you get over that last rise and you start heading down into Queenstown, oh my goodness, who detonated the atomic bomb? And anybody who's seen it doesn't need to any further explanation. It's devoid of vegetation and well and truly mined. It's not the prettiest looking place in the world. Probably second only to Port Pirie, I think, in ghastliness in some senses. And the last comment was about Milford Sound. Very fortunate. When I went there, it was not a cloud in the sky type couple of days, and just beautiful. The whole Milford Sound, the ferry trip and all, it's a feast for the eyes. You've got to do it. Obviously, you've got to get the weather, but you absolutely have to do it. A bit like the Christchurch Greymouth train trip. You just got to do it. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, I hope to get back to Milford one day, but there are a lot of other places that I had to get to, and as a result of touring New Zealand several times, I now have some friends over there. If anybody's watching from New Zealand, g'day. Kia ora. And I hope the comment I made about the lady operating the PA system at Greymouth in fluent Kiwi that needed translation wasn't taken the wrong way, but I couldn't understand a bloody word she was saying. And the further south you go in New Zealand, the worse the understanding goes. A lot of the words are different too. They don't have shopping trolleys over there, they have trundles. And they don't have thongs over there, they have jandals. Common fish, brill, hoki. Food's somewhat different. Not as different as America, but certainly different. I mean, America, you ask them for a meat pie and they say, "What? You want meat in a pastry pie?" They just don't get their heads around it. They think of a pie as being a sweet thing. Apple, sugar. I don't know, somebody could make a bit of money by launching the meat pie in America. Sorry, I'm getting very cynical. Oh dear, I could get myself in hot water. VK3ECG, rescue me. VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML and the group VK3ECG. Yes, absolutely. I was just trying to think of my embarrassing language thing in New Zealand, which is quite a few years ago now. Must be probably close on 30 years ago. And I was in Wanaka. I'd gone to a conference, and for some reason I got rung up by somebody who desperately needed me to sign some documents and or something anyway. I had to send something back to them as a signed document, and I shot down to the post office to see how quickly they could get this across to me, and the the lady behind the post counter said, "Don't worry, I'll fix it for you." And I said, "Well, how are you going to fix it?" She said, "Well, with the fix machine." And pointing to the fax machine on the other side of the room, and then that's where I realised that there was a fundamental failure of communication from time to time, and there have been other such occasions, but that was the one that first took my breath away when I appreciated some of the difficulties with the language. But yes, there's a few other word things, but then there's a few from the UK as well, so one lives with these things, and I had to explain several times what flip-flops were and things like that, but there we are. Yes, I mean, so that wilderness in Tasmania is amazing, isn't it? Peter, it's an extraordinary place. I always think there's sort of bits that look like they should have been in Doctor Who programs and possibly. So of course some of them were, but there we are. Yeah, I was just trying to think. Yes, the noise on the fans. Yes, I've got a similar sort of thing here. My power supply has got which is a fully regulated supply, and as soon as I transmit for a short while, the fan comes on after a minute or two. Although it never seems to be very hot, but it just creates that background noise, and same with the transceiver and so on. So I really ought to put them sort of down under the desk and away, and just to lower the ambient noise, but it isn't bad enough to really cause me a great deal of difficulties. But yeah, it's been a nice day. Yeah, the fan's just kicked in now. It's been quite a nice day. It's actually my birthday today, so we went out to a winery, which was fantastic because we could get in, I think, largely because no one expected to be able to take bookings this weekend. They all thought it was going to be start next week, and as a result, when they changed and it brought the dropping of some of the restrictions a bit early, I launched in quickly and made a booking, and indeed it was empty at that stage because they hadn't expected to be open that weekend, but they were. And although it was a lovely day yesterday, but not so great today, it was a very nice occasion to go to a winery and settle back and try a different Pinot from which was very, very nice with the family. So that was good. And then of course when you come back from something like that, you need a quiet nap. But otherwise it was pretty good. Anyway, Chris, back to you. VK3AML, the group VK3ECG.
VK3ECG and group VK3AML. Wanaka. Interesting place to have a conference. It's very pleasant by the lake there. It's fairly remote. How would you get there? I suppose you'd take a plane to Queenstown and then drive up. I don't know. It's a lot closer to Queenstown than to Christchurch from memory, and I think Queenstown has an international airport. I should imagine that the flights there would be a bit more expensive than they would be to Christchurch, where most of the people go through. I'll have to go back to New Zealand soon. And you're right about Tasmania. I've done a lot of hiking when I was much younger, 40 years younger, through southwest Tasmania, including Port Davey, Melaleuca Inlet. Macquarie Harbour's my favourite part of it. And I did notice that when they produced that excellent TV series about 15 years ago called Walking with Dinosaurs, where with animatronics and with various computer animation techniques they managed to bring dinosaurs back to life, I believe I read that quite a bit of it with the Jurassic background of plants, they actually filmed in southwest Tasmania because so many Gondwanaland relics are there. Celery top pine, king billy pine, Huon pine, and a lot of the more primitive plants give it that unique, almost Jurassic look. And a lot of the invertebrate species they've got there, like shield shrimps, I think are closely related to trilobites, very primitive creatures. An interesting place. I mean, I somehow have developed an interest in lands south of 40 degrees south, and there's not all that many of them. Tasmania, southern part of New Zealand, Stewart Island, Auckland Island, Campbell Island, Macquarie Island, Kerguelen in the middle of the Indian Ocean but far south, and various other little bits of land. Going to them and seeing Gondwanaland relics there, and Antarctic plants like the megaflora. The megafauna have been dead since the Permian. Sorry, I get my terms crossed. The closest I've got to seeing megaflora was Stewart Island, and there were some plants common to the subantarctic islands there. But where I've seen most of them was, believe it or not, in the Hobart Botanic Gardens. They have a cool house, not a hot house, with all displaying different types of plants from Macquarie Island and under a constant spray of drizzle from sprays in the room. That's fascinating. At least I find it so. I'm very much more interested in travelling south of Australia than I am travelling to the tropics. I suppose it's a function of the fair skin and the Irish background. I don't like heat. And on to John. I see you're in the 1966 call book in East Camberwell. You're not far from where I grew up. I grew up in East Hawthorn, off Pleasant Road, which runs between Taronga and Burke. My parents bought a house there in 1949 after living in East St Kilda and going out to the outer suburbs of East Hawthorn in 1949. It scandalised my grandparents because they were living in then rural Balwyn in an orchard. You wouldn't think of it now, would you? But yeah, Dominic Street, don't know it. Is that near St Dominic's, the big black church in Riversdale Road? I'll hand it back to you, John. VK3BLX and group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Yeah, that's right, Chris, right beside it. Dominic Street runs right beside St Dominic's Church, which also has the Priory attached to it, and that used to have a population of, 30 or more priests and students in those days, when there was a ready supply of young men happy to go into religious orders, and we knew most of them. I was a young Catholic boy and went to the local Catholic school, and we had a lot to do with all the priests and brothers and what have you. A far cry from now. I think the place is totally deserted, unless there happens to be a couple of young blokes from Vietnam or something or other, which seems to be the place they tend to recruit young Catholic priests from these days. Yes, those were the days. I'm trying to think of the name of the... you were a ham in those days, so you might not have known. Down in Hawthorn there was a sort of a surplus cum ham radio supply place. I just can't remember, it's Power Street or somewhere down that way. I think that might be where I got my modulation transformer. So you were probably very well placed to pick up bits if only you'd had a ticket. Any other comments? Not at the moment. Look, I'll stick it back to you. You can pass it around. VK3AML, VK3BLX.
The only one I can think of near Power Street, when I first bought a crystal for a crystal set, ham radio suppliers controlled by Snowy Milburn and his son and a couple of employees, was in Melville Street, Hawthorn, off Power, I think. And that would have been 1965. Later, about 1970, in Glenferrie Road, Hawthorn, there was a place called Wayne Communication Electronics. And the source of their stuff was they bought a lot of surplus stuff from the Gove tracking station on Cape York when it closed. And they spent years selling this stuff. You could buy miniature valves there for 20 cents each, sockets for 10. I'm trying to think what else I bought there. I bought a whole leak valve amplifier there with 2 KD66s in it. They couldn't get rid of them in those days. Now people pay through the nose for them, I think unjustifiably, because they've got fairly high intermod and harmonic distortion compared to a well-designed solid-state rig, but try to tell the valve nuts that. But mostly I used to go to Wayne's because they had lots of obscure CRTs, a lot of them designed for photographic work with blue short persistence phosphors, and of course what they were good for, was extremely good for, was flying spot scanning, which you would be familiar with if you were involved with the early SSTV. Just on that subject, John, the last week or so a group of us have been fiddling not with slow scan TV software, but with radio fax software. And if you speed it up to 240 lines per minute, you can transmit a really high definition image, good grayscale, black and white, in about 5 minutes, about twice the transmit time of a normal slow scan picture with no greater bandwidth. Because when you get rid of the colour component, you can multiply the number of pixels per second by 3. Because the way analog slow scan rather inefficiently works is to scan each line red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green, blue, and that triples the effective amount of bandwidth. If you just scan it as black and white and are prepared to take a bit of time, you can really get good results out of the old WeFax fax software. So I uploaded to YouTube a couple of fax pictures of this shack in about 1,000 lines definition, 5-minute scan, and I put the audio of the stream on the soundtrack, and a few people have picked it up and said, look, we must give this a try on HF, because it should get through just as well as normal slow scan, but with far better picture quality. So you may hear some interesting things from that. There's a software package called FL Digi, one word, FL Digi, and it's freeware, and it can generate and demodulate, not slow scan, but fax, and good grayscale fax. Why nobody's used it so far is anybody's guess. I'll hand it round to Peter, VK3ACZ and Group. Oh, and I was very amused by your discussion of the Kia. Yeah, they kept me not so much amused, although there was that, but just amazed at the obvious intelligence. You could see from the eyes and the actions that there was something going on behind the eyes. The mechanism was operating. They were thinking, almost frighteningly so. VK3ACZ and Group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and Group VK3ACZ. Yes, a truly remarkable bird. And first thing, Chris, I want to say that I share your enthusiasm about heading south rather than north. I remember some years back there was a job called for somebody to assist with the eradication of rabbits program on Macquarie Island, and I tell you what, if they were still there, I'd almost put my hand up for it. Right now, I would love to see Macquarie Island. The Antarctic shelf itself, not quite the same degree of interest. You know, white isn't my favourite colour, hi. But having said that, I did speak with Paul, VK0PD, on 20 metres last Sunday, so that's as close as I want to get to Antarctica, but no, Macquarie Island would be good. And it's been a funny week on the subject of DX. I always join a 70 centimetre net each Wednesday night and say too much DX is never enough. But it's been a funny week this week. It's the first time I've had more success on the grey line on 40 than I have on 20. The last few weeks, especially 20's just been going gangbusters. Oh, goodness, it surely isn't always like that. You know, I've only got a year of amateur radio experience to go by, but I don't remember this time last year it being so good on the long path. But we had a CME last week that buggered things up for a little while, Tuesday week ago, but I don't know what it was. This Tuesday I made 2 contacts for the afternoon. For John's benefit, I go out portable rather than put up with the QR Mary at home. I've got a slightly quieter spot that I go to, and there's a bit of work to get there. Take a 100 amp hour battery with me, and it's just been one of those funny things. And Thursday night, the DX was starting to run on 40 into the night, and I was getting close to curfew time, and I ended up deciding that, well, no, I won't try and risk going home like, you know, the drunk driver trying to avoid the booze buses by going down the back streets. What I did is that I stayed out till after 12 and then drove home legally. There you go. And anyway, one last comment for this over is it seemed to slip through to the keeper that Dave said it was his birthday today. So happy birthday, Dave. And in honour of that, I'm going to quote, now I know you haven't lived your life hiding under a rock, so you'll know the goodies. And whilst I can remember the poem, I can't remember whether it was Graham Garden or Tim Brooke Taylor who said it to Bill Oddie in an episode where he was very unhappy about being reminded that it was his birthday. Hope you remember the episode. But it went. The poem went like this: Your birthday's here, so give a cheer. You've lasted through another year. Be sure you have some birthday fun. You may not get another one. Happy birthday, Dave. VK3AML on the group, VK3ACZ.
My God. Backhanded comment. Grim. Anyway, let me add my own birthday wishes to those of Peter, Dave. It's remiss of me not to have come back with that at the very least. When you get to our age, every new one is a bonus. And I really should get out and get some more exercise. I've been noticing that my level of fitness has really gone down with this shut-in, I suppose understandably so. And slightly in compensation, my wife and I have both got into the culinary compensation, and it's not doing us much good. So hopefully this next 12 months, if we get out and about, I'll be doing a lot more portable work. So I might come up your way, Peter, up on One Tree Hill with the digital slow scan gear fairly soon, as much to get some exercise as to do the slow scan transmitting. Round to Dave, the birthday boy, VK3CG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3ECG. Well, thank you very much. Yes, yes, I do remember the goodies. One of my favourites, I have to say, and the use of very crude video effects. Remember the giant guinea pig and things like that. You know, great stuff. And of course the bicycle made for three. Great stuff. Now, interesting. You talk about some of the old shops to pick up things in my day, and as I said, it was sort of in London. I think I must have got my license in 71 or 72, something like that. 71, I think. And then, and everything was the best places to go. There were lots of places in the East End, but the best place to go for stuff was the Edgware Road. Extraordinary place, Edgware Road. It had the most amazing military disposal shops, but but they were very specialist. It wasn't sort of things you get these days with sort of you know, so-called ex-uniforms, many of which are just made up cheap. These were, you know, pallets of old stuff that was basically Second World War stuff that was still in back of warehouses, and they would buy them up by the tonnage, I think, and sell them. So there was an extraordinary range of equipment, and of course that's what we used in the old B40s and things like that, and many of them were, of course, relatively insensitive and benefited from having interesting sort of preamps put on the receivers and so on, but some of the selectivity wasn't that great. But anyway, it was wonderful stuff, and of course the Edgware Road was also fabulous. It's actually the original old Roman Watling Street, the incredible long road, but it had all the wonderful Indian restaurants there, and some of the early Greek Cyprus restaurants and so on. So it was actually quite an interesting place to go, and friends, and when I was at school, we'd go up to London for something, and on the underground, and we might, you know, go up Edgware Road or whatever it is for to find an interesting restaurant. I remember going once with a friend of mine, and this is the days where, you know, eating foreign food was fairly rare, and I remember we went to some Greek place, and there were a couple of Indian sent friends of ours, and we sat around this table, and this one guy, he's actually a guy now in Western Australia actually, but he was sitting there saying, well, what are these things? And we said, oh, they're green beans. So he said, oh, I like beans, and he you know, put a couple in his mouth straight away and tried to eat them. They were, of course, thin green chilies, and we just laughed our heads off as this guy went brighter and brighter red, and you know, and had to leave the room fairly rapidly. Yeah, so Edgware Road was a great place to pick up anything, any components, tubes, whatever you wanted. Extraordinary place. So, yeah, I'm just trying to think. Yes, Queenstown, it certainly has got an international airport. I've flown directly into Queenstown from Australia, and in fact, when I last flew out of Queenstown, this is where the medical conferences come in, you see, because they go to nice places like the one in Moana. And that was an interesting flight. The Queenstown International Airport, when I left last time, I had a meeting there, it was a few years ago now, the computer system had entirely failed, and behind all of the desks there were large pictures of aircraft, and they were issuing handwritten boarding slips, effectively, and they were ticking off the seats on these big pictures of the aircraft on butcher's paper behind the check-in desks. And we're talking about, well, you know, we're only talking about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. So, you know, when these things do actually happen, it can be quite dramatic, and it was one of the funniest experiences I've ever had at an airport, actually, although it did delay things somewhat for people. But my trip to Wanaka was even better, because I had no idea. I think I'd only been in Australia for a couple of years, and I'd sort of said to, you know, the secretary or the person who organised flights at work, I've got to go to this thing at Wanaka. And she said, how do you want to go? And I said, oh, I want to fly, you know. And she said, she looked at me a bit strangely and said, yeah, okay, I'll organise it then. And so I got a direct flight to Queenstown, and then I had to go to the other side of the airport where there were small light aircraft flew me from Queenstown to Wanaka. And the flight was single prop Cessna type thing. I presume it was a Cessna. And we never got above the mountaintop, so we flew above the snow line along those valleys to get to Wanaka, and it was one of the most beautiful flights I think I have ever been. It was when I flew out, because it was a return fare. When I flew out, I think the only other occupant was a mother and child, and the child had broken their legs skiing or something, was being flown out. And it was an absolute magnificent trip. I think other people had taken buses or coaches or something like that, and I felt very lofty to have arrived by a light aircraft. A complete fluke, because I had no idea what New Zealand was like. I'd only been in the Southern Hemisphere for the first time for a year or two by that stage. Anyway, Chris, back to you. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
Oh, I'm very envious. Do we have another breaker there, by the way? No, nobody else breaking. I feel very envious. The light aircraft that I've travelled in, I think the first really spectacular flight I ever took was when I moved to live on Flinders Island in 1977, 44 years ago, better part of half a century ago. I flew in a two-engine plane that flew at, I think, 5,000 feet at that stage, and at that height you can relate to things on the ground. We flew over Inverloch at that height, and then to the neck of Wilson's Promontory, and then the pilot turned right. We flew over the top of Wilson's Promontory at a height where you could actually see people and cars and almost wave to people. And then you flew across all of the rocks and the islands and the islets that extend in what used to be the peaks of a land bridge, basically going all the way from Victoria to Tasmania. Redondo Island, at the Answer Group, Curtis, Hogan, Deal, Erith Dover, Wrights Rock, and a knife of black rock sticking out of the ocean called Devil's Tower, and I saw those all at close range. When I redid the flight on a commercial flight from Essendon in 2018 with Dave 3ASE, it was so disappointing. We flew at something like 20,000 feet, and that whole effect had gone. all the things were still there down below, but we were too high to really appreciate them until just the start and the finish of the flight. So yeah, that's something I'd really like to do more of, light plane stuff, particularly in interesting locations. At Wanaka, you'd be flying around the formerly glaciated valleys of the Southern Alps, so it would be really spectacular, and you would have seen some really wild country too. I should hand it round to VK3BLX, the Catholic boy. I shouldn't say it that way, but in the old days we used to. I used to go to Camberwell Central School in Camberwell Junction, which became Camberwell Primary later on, and we were opposite Our Lady of Victory's Catholic School on the other side of Reserve Road, just north of Camberwell, just south of Camberwell Junction, and we always regarded the mix as being the enemy. There were lots of Dagos that went to that school. Sorry, Italian immigrants. Anyway, VK3BLX and the group, apologies, very non-PC. Daddy smack. VK3BLX and the group VK3AML. I'm being silly.
VK3AML, VK3BLX. Oh, proddy dogs, sneak like frogs. Oh, no, heaven forbid. Oh, those are the days. Did you, throw stones at the kids from the Catholic school as you went by? It was the sort of thing that went on, was it? The boys would occasionally have a bit of a scrap in the lane or something. God, wasn't it absolutely ridiculous when you look back? Absolutely crazy. The good old days, they call those. A couple of things that came to mind as you were talking. I'll just run down the little list I've made here. Queenstown. What a difference between Queenstown, New Zealand and Queenstown, Tasmania. Same name. Quite different scenery though, isn't it? Deal Rock. Oh, you mentioned you did that light communication between Deal Rock and I can't remember where you sit on the mainland. What sort of distance was that? Was that direct line of sight, or was it via a scattered route or off the clouds? I'm sort of interested to know just how you did that one. Now, just earlier this evening when I was trying to figure out how to find your YouTube stream, I came across that very one that you were talking about, where you were showing the fax-based high-res picture. So I had a look at that and I let it run for a few seconds listening to the audio, and I noted the very good quality of that monochrome picture. So I knew exactly what you were talking about when you explained that. It was a happy coincidence that I came across it. What else did I have jotted down here? Oh, one comment. I thought that on the YouTube stream, the audio level seems to me to be quite low compared to kind of anything else that I play on YouTube. Is that intentional, or what is it? Or is it just me? VK3AML on the group, VK3BLX.
It's not just you, but I think I'm down by about 6 dB on where I should be, and I think it's a fault of my sound card, so I'll eventually upgrade. But as long as I get the quality, I'm reasonably happy. But on some tablets and portable laptops, just occasionally I lose a word. I'm getting old, 67. Just occasionally on laptops, they don't have enough gain in the audio to make the best of the stream. But it's the quality's there. I'm just looking at dropped frames, 0. So obviously, whatever we're doing, compared to what I was having trouble with in days gone by with that old modem and the old cable to the street, it's all fixed now. So roll on more videos. I'll have to edit more of the stuff I've got stored away in 4K, and my various trips around the place. I've shot a lot that I've never put together, and a lot of that coverage of the Trans-Alpine rail I haven't seen since the day I'd shot it, so it all came back. The distance, Deal Island is very much an island, not a rock. It's about, in the old measure, 5 miles by 5 miles. It's quite a bit of acreage. It's got forests on it, it's got kangaroos, it's got possums, penguins in one rookery on the west side of the island, and a tremendous number of Cape Barren geese. There's a lighthouse settlement there too, so it was very much an island, not just a rock. It's slap bang halfway between the tip of Wilson's Promontory and the northern end of Flinders Island. And the distance from Deal Island to where we were communicating with a place called Blackwarry on the Grand Ridge Road is 136 kilometres. So it was a pretty good old haul. It was line of sight. There are a lot of parts of Tasmania, officially parts of Tasmania, that are line of sight to Victoria. Closest one is Hogan Island off Wilson's Promontory, but there's no proper shelter there. There are no trees. There's a survival shelter, but there's only room for one. Whereas Deal Island, we could set up a proper camp at a little stream running and everything. But the other line of sight is from Mount Cowley in the Otways, looking south to the northern end of King Island. A place called Wickham Hill at the northern end of King Island is in the order of 80 kilometres, I think. Not even as far as we went with Deal. So from the northern end of King Island, I'm told you can see the mountains of the Otways whenever there's a clear day. And King Island is VK7. Just there's, as far as I know at the moment, there are no hams living there. There have been in the past. There was one F call was there until recently, and there was a full call who was blind, who lived at Curry, I think, in the southern end of King Island, who died about 10 years ago. Nice bloke too. I spoke to him on the phone a couple of times. Yeah, about the... Oh, you mentioned the Murphy B40, Dave. I had two B40s at one stage, and their principal problem with them was drift. They had a thing like a hugely scaled up turret tuner in them, like an old turret tuner from a television set, but about 30 times the size, so that you could bring in the different bands on HF. And the trouble was, as you rotated it, the contacts didn't always have the same inter-electrode capacity, and they would drift. So it was great for CW, where you could afford to have drifting pitch, but with sideband it was a dead loss. They were quite sensitive, but broad and drifty is my memory of it, and I eventually sold them both, swapped them I think to Eric VK3AX, who did up one of them as a museum piece, and the other one I think sold or something. And I at that stage had gotten interested in digital comms and digital slow scan with multiple subcarriers spaced 50 hertz apart. You really need several orders of magnitude more stability over a 3-minute period than you can get from any non-expensive valve gear, particularly with valve oscillators heating up and varying in frequency. Going just from valve to solid state, you lose a lot of the problems with heat in terms of oscillator stability frequencies. And then of course you going to synthesized rigs, you get another degree of stability again, to the point where it makes the old valve gear look prehistoric. So, round to VK3ACZ with a pause for any breakers. If anybody else would like to make a comment or chip in. VK3ACZ with a pause, VK3AML.
Yeah, nothing heard. VK3AML in the group VK3ACZ. And you're talking about the Bass Strait Islands reminds me that VK7 Oscar Radio, Owen came up again on REC during the week and reported that there'd been some 70 centimetre troppo as well over there. Yeah, he comes up a bit. I've worked him on, well, I was getting troppo over to Mount William and worked him from down at Yolla and Tassie there. Where is it? Somewhere just south of Burnie, I think. Nice memory, and I still have fond memories of seeing that film footage of you, Chris, talking to 7AR Harry Young, yeah, down there on their link system from Deal Island. All good. Now, yes, Queenstown. The two, you're right, John. The two places couldn't be further apart, could they? If they tried. One looks beautiful beyond belief. The other one, as I said before, looks like an atomic bomb has been detonated there. But there you go. One last comment for this over, Chris. Last week or the week before, I mentioned something about Suisun Bay in San Francisco with the derelict naval vessels that I saw all moored or tied up there in the bay. I finally got on to somebody in San Francisco. Oh, bless international communication. And he informed me that, yes, I was right, but in 2004 when I went through there on the train in the opposite direction to you, I went from Chicago to Emeryville, but there were probably 60 or more warships of various kinds moored there. Apparently they'd become a pollution hazard with oil and paint peeling and whatever else, so that most of them have finally been sold off for scrap. Plus the the latest satellite photos I saw showed that there were only about 6 old vessels there. So that solved my little mystery. I couldn't work out whether my memory had been totally defective or what the story was with the naval vessels in Suisun Bay. But good of you to actually identify the name of it, because I certainly didn't remember that. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
I definitely remember seeing about 20 vessels at a great distance from the train in Suisun Bay, the ship graveyard or whatever, where they were mothballed. And I went through there in January 2008, 13 years ago. And I'm hoping actually that on the live stream my friends over in Salt Lake City might be looking in. One of them, I got a phone call from Tom, VK3FTOM, who's about 15 years old, and he said, I've been asked to ring you, does KA7OEI mean anything to you? And I said, oh, good heavens, that's Clint, who I did the trip round from Salt Lake City through Arizona and Boulder Dam down through Vegas to Southern California back in 2008. And Tom FTOM had just been talking to him on a link system. So it's a small world, a very small world for ham radio, that's for sure. But yeah, I'll be curious to know what connection you saw the Murphy B40s, and if they're the B40s that I'm talking about, Dave, have you recovered from hernia yet? VK3ECG and group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3ECG, yes. Those are definitely the ones. The one was with a big turret right down the middle at the front, and with an interesting display. But yes, they drifted like mad, didn't they? I think they were still being used by people, but as you say, probably mostly CW and nothing much else. And various people had various design systems and to fix them and prevent drift, but I don't think they were to last very long. But there were just so many of them. This is the extraordinary thing about those shops in Edgware Road. There were just stacks of them, and these shops seem to sort of they'd change from week to week. They'd bring a new pallet in from some RAF or naval base that was being having its warehouses emptied and things like this. So there was always something interesting. A lot of people just bought them and, of course, just dismantled them for components and things like that. A lot of things which would probably be nice museum pieces now were probably just destroyed in that way. Interesting. Interesting times. Oh, the one thing. Oh yes. So you were talking about I realised I had a note here about the Kias, and I was thinking about the cockatoos with who again there was I think a person on ABC Radio National was talking about studies of cockatoos and how clever they are also getting at opening wheelie bins and getting food out and so on, and then it's not all the birds. It appears to be some sort of select subtype, and then they get used by the other birds to deal with the bin. So it's in the actual flock. So it's really interesting bits of classic bird behaviour. But anyway, look, I'm not going to hold it, guys. I think I shall pull the pin and catch up, no doubt, next week. Looking forward to whatever comes our way. Chris, thank you very much for a fantastic film and great editing, and really lovely to see that wonderful countryside again, and that sort of alpine area is just absolutely stunning. And yes, you'll have to get down to the fjordlands again. And hopefully get a bit better weather. It's strange because you actually do need the rain in order to get the spectacular waterfalls, but they keep going for quite a while after the rain, so you want to have a nice rainy period and then a nice sunny period with which to do the boat trips and see the waterfalls. It certainly is absolutely spectacular. Anyway, I wish everyone 73s, and catch you all again. Hopefully next weekend. We'll see how everything goes. This is VK3ECG. I'll go off and clear now. So thanks very much, everyone. Off and clear with AML, ACZ. Good evening, Peter, and BLX. Good evening, John. Hope to work again soon. Cheers, then.
Yeah, good night, Dave.
Cheers, Dave.
Yeah, cheers, Dave. And John, BLX, I'm not quite sure whether I've ever asked you where you are. You're obviously not East Camberwell now, although you have a strong signal into Burwood East. I'm near the corner of Highbury and Blackburn Road, and not too far from the Kmart that's at the corner of Blackburn Road and Burwood Highway. So just curious to know where you are, John. And I guess we better start wrapping up. I've been on the radio now since 9:30, 3 hours. I see is the video stream that I've generated for YouTube Live. It's frightening to think that somewhere there must be this massive memory bank that YouTube has. It must be vast. I mean, imagine if I, as one little person, have produced in a week a 3-hour stream of 1080p. Imagine how much must be there. VK3BLX, perhaps for finals, VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Yes, I've often wondered that myself, Chris, just how all this stuff is stored. It must be, the server farms must be just humongous. Let me see, I had a couple of things I was going to comment on. Earlier in the piece you were talking about your history when you were just a little tacker and you were being babysat by hams. Well, I've got a 4-year-old grandson. He comes into the shack and says, "Oh, Papa, can I see my voice on the oscilloscope?" So it looks like I've started him off. Whether it's a good thing or whether I'm leading him down a dark path, I'm not sure, but no, time will tell, I guess. Dear. Yeah, well, just a comment on David's comments here about disposals shops. Well, I don't think we were too well provided for them in Melbourne. The only one I can really remember is the Waltham Trading Company in Elizabeth Street, which I used to frequent. Certainly every Friday afternoon after school I'd catch the train into the city and fossick around in there, and even then I don't think there was a hell of a lot of really good stuff available. Most of it was, stuff I didn't really understand, but I bought my valves and this and built stuff out of radio and hobbies as it was, and had a great time. But in later years, or not so long ago, I remember visiting the museum at Woomera, where they've got all the old, like the Jindovic and missiles and stuff that they developed back in the 60s, and well, it would have been the 60s, I guess, or even earlier. And they had these things cut away so you could see the insides, and glory be, there were all these things I recognised. There was all these valves and relays and, all exactly the same components that I'd been picking up at the disposal place in the city in the late 60s. So it's quite a throwback to see this stuff displayed. All right, well, look, it's been very pleasant to join you tonight, and I hope I can make it along on subsequent Saturday nights. Always nice to have a look at a bit of memorabilia, and I don't mind the odd travelling, I must say. Really good. And a bit of a chat, even better. All right, well, good evening, everyone. I hope to catch you all again next week. VK3AML in the group. Oh, by the way, sorry, I was going to say where I am. I'm in Mont Albert, quite close to the corner of Whitehorse Road and Union Road. So it'd be pretty well line of sight to you, I should think. I'm running about 50 watts or something here, so I'd be a bit surprised if it wasn't strong. Okay, see you next week. VK3AML in the group, VK3BLX.
Yeah, you're very close to where I was until 2014. I was within 2 streets of the telecom tower in Harding Street off Canterbury Road, top of the hill. And we sold that place for far more than we ever thought we'd get, as a consequence of which, when we moved to East Burwood, house is not all that much smaller, more convenient for us, but we were able to pocket half the sales price of the Surrey Hills house. So, yeah, know that area quite well. Okay, John, delighted to have you there. I better hand it round to Peter also to tie the ribbons, and then we'll all tootle off and I'll conclude the stream. I'll just have a quick look at the text on the stream. John Young says the word jandals might well be safer than thongs. Jared Quinn, good evening, everyone. Dan TTM, Chris was one of the first pioneers in using lasers to prove the Earth is flat. I wish. And Dan DTM talks about Utah server farms. Well, I know quite a few hams in Utah, so I'll ask them whether they know anything about the what do you call it, the YouTube storage. And I see we're down to about 6 people on the video stream, so I think it's getting a bit late for people. I expect a few people, particularly in New Zealand, which is 2 hours ahead of us. Probably they'll see this on replay. Over to you, Peter, for finals, VK3ACZ and Group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the rapidly diminishing group from VK3ACZ. And yes, John, as I said before, you've got a great signal over at Boronia. Your 40 red jelly beans over 9. Good stuff. And yeah, well, all I can say is thank you again, Chris, for a wonderful trip down memory lane, as well as just checking some beautiful scenery yet again. Makes me sad for 2 reasons. One, I want to go there tomorrow, and the other one is remembering my dearly beloved that I was over there with, and still miss her heaps. But it'll be wonderful to go over there and share it with Sandra eventually when we're allowed. Hope the lockup does progress. Somebody was very pessimistically trying to tell me today that if the case numbers continue to go up, Dan will go against his word, but well, I hope not in both counts. But definitely one last thing. A certain member of the Sherbrooke Club who you weren't very impressed with some of his comments about the COVID situation. He's aired his disgust about the club enforcing the no jab, no turn up for club meetings policy, which, as I understand, we're required to do by law anyway. But there you go. That's just a bit of information for you to tuck under your sleeve somewhere. Thank you again. Excellent broadcast. All the better that no drop frames, no buffering, no nothing like that. Just superb. And couldn't appreciate it more. Look forward to next week. Chris, have a great week. Have a great week there, John. And thanks for coming up too. Made tonight even more interesting. Cheers and 7-3 to all. VK3AML, VK3ACZ. Good night.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And all the best to you. Thanks for staying up for the bit of extra. Next week I'll have to look at editing a bit more of that New Zealand stuff. Perhaps the visit to the National Institute of Water and Air, the atmospheric monitoring station at Lauder that we went to, or perhaps some footage. I still have the footage of the completely useless trip to Milford Sound that I've never put together. But of course all you see is white and people describing where things should be, and you can't see them. It was a bit on the funny side, really. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. All the best. VK3AML now closing, and I'll be closing the stream also. All the best, and thank you to the viewers on the stream as well as the people listening on radio. VK3AML clear. Okay, people, I'm very glad with the results of the stream. It's consistently giving me constant 1080p resolution, so we'll continue this as long as I can economically do it. We have no lost frames. It looks like we've fixed all of the internet issues that we had at this address, and it's just a matter of digging through my material for more material. So if anybody would like to request anything, perhaps give me an email at vk3aml@optusnet.com.au. My email address again, vk3aml@optusnet.com.au. And if you have any particular interests in radio, one area that I might be able to get people interested, in Invercargill, Mike and I unexpectedly came across the biggest motorcycle museums in Australasia. A vast collection of motorbikes, the earliest of which was 1900 vintage. Unbelievable. And every conceivable mode of mechanism, and you name it, they have it. I'll have to edit that stuff together too. Anyway, with that, very happy with the results tonight, and I hope I can keep it up. All the best to everybody, and thanks for listening.